Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. Have you ever heard a voice when no one is around? It's the kind of thing you might brush off as imagination, an odd glitch in the mind. But what if that voice wasn't in your head at all? I didn't believe in things like that. Not at first. But then it happened to me. I had just come home from work, tired but looking forward to relaxing for the evening. I put my headphones on, settled into my favorite chair, and hit play. The usual playlist, the same tunes I'd listened to countless times. There was a comfort in the predictability of it. But tonight was different. As I closed my eyes, letting the music wash over me, I heard it. At first, it was faint, a breath, almost like a whisper. I thought it was part of the music, some subtle background effect, but then it came again, clearer this time. Emily. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I pulled the headphones off quickly, feeling a sudden rush of cold air on my ears. But the sound didn't stop. There was no music coming through the speakers. No song. Just nothing. I stared at the headphones in my hands, my breath shallow. Was I hearing things? I put them back on, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just a trick of the mind. But then, again, the voice. Emily. It was unmistakable. And it wasn't coming from the headphones. It wasn't coming from anywhere. It was just there. The voice sounded so familiar, so personal. The tone was soft, almost gentle, yet it sent a shiver down my spine. I jerked the headphones off once more. Nothing. The room was quiet, normal. I looked around, but no one was there. My phone was still on the table, untouched. I checked the connection to the headphones. Everything was as it should be. They weren't plugged into anything. I stood up, pacing. My mind raced. Maybe I was just overtired, or maybe the quiet had played tricks on me. I tried to convince myself that it was just a momentary lapse in reality. A fleeting, strange experience. But deep down, I knew it was something more. Something I couldn't explain. I sat back down, trying to shake off the unease, but as I did, I noticed something else. The air felt different. The familiar hum of my apartment, distant traffic, the occasional creak of the floorboards, was gone. In its place was a silence so deep it felt suffocating. I glanced over at the door. It was slightly ajar, though I was sure I had closed it earlier. My pulse quickened as I moved toward it, my feet feeling heavy, like I was wading through thick water. I reached out to push the door open fully, but before I could, I heard it again. This time, louder. Clearer. Emily, come closer. The voice didn't come from the headphones. It didn't come from the room at all. It was coming from behind me. My breath caught in my throat. I turned around slowly, expecting to see someone standing in the doorway. But there was nothing. No figure, no shadow. Just emptiness. I backed away from the door, my body tensing. I wasn't sure what I was afraid of, but I knew that something wasn't right. I needed to leave, to get out of the room, but my legs felt like lead. Then, another whisper, closer this time, like it was right next to me. "Emily, I've been waiting for you." I spun around again, but no one was there. My heart raced, the pounding deafening in my ears. I reached for my phone to call someone, but before I could, a noise pierced the silence, a soft clicking sound like a button being pressed repeatedly. I stared at my phone. It was still untouched, but the screen flickered to life. The playlist, the one I had been listening to, appeared on the screen. But the song that played next was not one I recognized. "Emily." The voice was unmistakable. It came from the speakers, the sound vibrating through my body, and I felt a chill sweep across me. It wasn't a part of the song. It was real. I stumbled back, tearing the headphones off and tossing them onto the table. My mind raced. What was happening? Why was my name being spoken by this unseen voice? It didn't make sense. I checked the headphones again. No wires. No connections. They weren't plugged into anything. And yet, the voice kept coming, filling the space around me, louder with each passing second. "Emily." A cold, icy chill crept up my spine. I felt it in my bones, the overwhelming sense that something was wrong. Something had changed. I wasn't alone anymore. Have you ever heard your name when no one else is around? I didn't believe in things like that. Ghost stories, superstitions, all of it seemed like nothing more than a figment of someone's imagination, a way to explain the unexplainable. But the moment I heard my name, whispered softly in my headphones, I started to wonder if I had been wrong. It was a typical evening, quiet and calm. I had just finished work and decided to unwind by listening to my favorite playlist. I plugged in my headphones, closed my eyes, and let the music flood my senses. The rhythm of the songs, the gentle hum of the melodies, it was all so soothing. But then, the music stopped. I opened my eyes, half expecting to see the player had paused, but the screen on my phone was still glowing, and the app was running perfectly fine. There was no indication that anything had gone wrong. The sound should have been playing, but all I heard was a soft whisper. At first, I thought it was just the sound of the room. Maybe it was a trick of the wind or the hum of the old apartment building, but then it came again. "Olivia." My heart stopped. My name. I ripped the headphones out of my ears and stared at them as though they had somehow betrayed me. The cables were neatly coiled, not plugged into anything. The headphones weren't even connected to my phone. There was no sound coming from anywhere. Nothing had been playing. So how could I have heard that? I tried to shake it off. It was probably just my imagination. After all, I'd been working late, and the stress of the day must have gotten to me. But even as I tried to calm myself, I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. I placed the headphones on the table and walked over to the window, hoping some fresh air would clear my mind. But the soft hum of the city outside didn't help. Instead, it only made the silence inside feel more oppressive. It was only then that I noticed something odd. The light in the hallway outside my apartment was flickering. Just a soft flicker, but it made the space feel wrong. Like the very air around me was unsettled. I returned to my desk, my fingers trembling slightly as I picked up the headphones again. I turned them over, inspecting them carefully. No wires out of place. No defects. Nothing that would explain the whisper. I put them back on, hoping to prove to myself that I was just imagining things. And that's when it happened again. Olivia. Louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't in my ear, it was inside my head. I jumped up from my chair, ripping the headphones off again, this time more forcefully. My pulse raced as I looked around the room, half expecting someone to be standing there, watching me. But there was no one. Just the cold emptiness of the apartment and the steady tick of the clock on the wall. My thoughts spiraled. What was going on? How could I hear my name like that? Why was it so clear? So real? I tried to think logically. Maybe the headphones were malfunctioning, picking up some strange interference. I opened the music app on my phone again and checked the connection. Everything was fine. The app was still running smoothly, no glitches, no issues. But that whisper, it didn't stop. Olivia. I froze, my hand still hovering over the phone screen. This time, the whisper wasn't just in my head, it was coming from the headphones themselves. I could feel it, the soft vibration in the pads, as if the sound was coming from within them. I slammed the headphones down on the desk, my breath quickening. My heart was pounding so loudly in my ears, I could hardly hear anything else. Something was wrong. I couldn't explain it. The room felt colder now, the air pressing in on me. It was as if the walls were closing in. The faint hum from the city outside had faded, leaving only silence, absolute, suffocating silence. And then I heard it again. But this time, it wasn't my name. It was something else. Help me. It was a voice now, not just a whisper. A voice full of desperation, full of something darker. It sent a chill down my spine. My hands trembled as I slowly picked up the headphones again, staring at them, half afraid they would say something else. But they were silent. No sound. No whispers. No voices. Just the quiet hum of the air, pressing in from every direction. I turned to leave the room. I needed to get out. Maybe some time away would clear my head. But as I reached for the door, I heard it once more. Olivia. This time, it was right behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. The room was empty. I was alone. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. What was happening? What was this? For the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to know the answer. I stood frozen, my hand still on the doorknob, but blood draining from my face. The whisper was gone now, but its presence lingered in the air. My skin prickled, as if something unseen was brushing against me. I turned around, scanning the room in a panic, but everything looked the same, unchanged, quiet, unnervingly still. I stepped away from the door and sat back down at my desk, trying to calm my racing heart. The headphones sat there on the table, innocuous, waiting. I couldn't tear my eyes away from them. They seemed wrong, like they were waiting for something. Or someone. But there was no way to explain what had just happened. The voice, the whisper, it didn't make sense. I checked my phone again, just to be sure. Still no sign of anything unusual. I opened my music app and glanced through the playlist I'd been listening to. It was all the same songs. Nothing strange. But then my phone buzzed in my hand. It was a text message from an unknown number. Olivia, you shouldn't have heard me. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the message, the words sending a cold wave through me. Who was this? How did they know my name? I tried to breathe, tried to tell myself it was just a prank. But a strange feeling settled in my chest, a gnawing certainty that this wasn't a joke. The air in the room felt too thick, too heavy, like something was pressing in from every corner. I had to get out of there. I grabbed my coat and rushed to the door, my fingers trembling as I fumbled with the handle. But as I opened it, I froze. The hallway outside my apartment was dark. And at the end of it, just at the edge of the light, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. There, standing motionless in the shadows, was a figure. I couldn't make out any details at first. The figure was cloaked in darkness, but there was something about it that felt familiar. My pulse quickened. I stepped back, nearly tripping over my own feet. My mind was racing, and every instinct screamed at me to run. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, breathing heavily. Was it real? Was I just seeing things? I turned back to the room, trying to collect my thoughts. My eyes flicked over to the desk, where the headphones still sat. The phone buzzed again, this time with a new message. "Don't ignore me, Olivia. I'm not done." The words felt like a punch in the gut, and my stomach churned with a sickening sense of dread. It wasn't just a prank. It was something more, something I couldn't explain. I didn't know what to do, didn't know who was behind this or why they were doing this. But I couldn't stay there anymore. Not with that figure in the hallway. Not with the voice still echoing in my mind. I grabbed my things, my phone, my purse, and bolted for the front door. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was away from there. I couldn't let this thing follow me. But as I reached the door, the lights in my apartment flickered. I spun around, panic rising, and saw it, the headphones. They were no longer sitting innocently on the desk. They were on the floor, in the center of the room. "Olivia," the voice came again, softer now, but still unmistakable. My heart slammed in my chest, and I hurried out the door, slamming it behind me. But as I reached the elevator, I froze once more. The hallway was empty. No figure. No shadow. Only the silence. The silence that seemed to scream. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, and I stepped inside, hands shaking. I pressed the button for the lobby and let out a breath, trying to steady myself. But as the elevator began to descend, I heard it again. "Olivia." It was right there. Inside the elevator. Behind me. In my ears. I turned around, my eyes wide with fear, but there was no one there. The elevator was empty. The voice came from nowhere. And then, just as quickly, it stopped. The silence returned. The doors opened, and I rushed out into the lobby, my eyes darting around. The feeling of being watched didn't go away, but at least there was no whispering, no voice calling my name. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me. Something that knew me, that was following me. I stepped outside into the cool night air, trying to calm myself, but the phone in my pocket buzzed once again. "I'm never far away, Olivia." My heart sank. The whisper had never left. I walked quickly, trying to shake off the panic that gripped me, but every step felt like I was being followed. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone there, but the street was empty. The cold air cut through me, but it didn't help clear the fog in my mind. Every part of me screamed to go back to my apartment to figure out what was going on. But something deep inside told me that going back would only make things worse. I tried to call my best friend, Emma, but the phone call went straight to voicemail. Of course. She was probably busy, or maybe just asleep. I didn't know what I expected her to do anyway. How could anyone help with this? It was something beyond anything I could explain. I kept walking, heading for the nearest cafe, hoping the familiar surroundings would offer me some comfort. The lights from the storefronts gleamed brightly in the dark, and the sound of chatter and clinking cups from inside the cafe made it seem like everything was normal, even though I felt anything but. I stepped inside and ordered a coffee, trying to force myself to relax. The barista smiled at me, but her eyes seemed distant, like she wasn't really seeing me. I wondered if I looked as frantic as I felt. I found an empty seat near the back of the cafe, away from the few patrons who were reading or typing on laptops. I sank into the chair, my fingers trembling as I wrapped them around the warm cup. The last thing I needed was to start making a scene, but the thoughts kept spiraling. That voice, my name, the whisper, the way it felt so personal. It was like it had been waiting for me to hear it. And then the text messages. They felt like warnings. I couldn't help but wonder who was behind all this. And how did they know my name? The sound of the door jingling caught my attention, and I looked up. A man stepped inside, a tall figure with messy dark hair and an air of quiet confidence. His eyes skimmed the room, briefly meeting mine, and then he walked past me, his footsteps soft against the tiled floor. I felt my heart skip a beat. It wasn't just the fact that he had looked at me. It was something about the way he moved, something familiar in the way he carried himself. I didn't know why, but I felt like I'd seen him before. I pushed the thought away. It was probably nothing. Maybe I was just too on edge. But then, as if the universe had a cruel sense of timing, my phone buzzed again. Olivia. The message was the same. My name. Again. I froze, staring at the screen, my blood running cold. The cafe around me seemed to blur, and the noise of the chatter faded into a muffled hum. I tried to take a breath, but it caught in my throat. I glanced around, looking for any signs of who might be behind it. But no one seemed to notice. No one seemed to care. The man who had entered the cafe was sitting now, at the counter, his back to me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was the one sending me the messages. My heart thudded in my chest as I realized that maybe I wasn't being paranoid. Maybe he was following me. The man turned slightly, as though he could feel my gaze on him, and our eyes met again. This time, he didn't look away. His expression was unreadable, but I could swear there was something unsettling about the way he looked at me. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I quickly turned my attention back to my phone. My fingers hovered over the screen, unsure whether I should reply to the message or ignore it. I wasn't sure which option was safer. But before I could make up my mind, something strange happened. The man got up and walked toward the door, but as he passed me, he stopped for just a moment. A brief pause. And then, just before he exited, he whispered, so softly that only I could hear it, "I'm not finished with you, Olivia." My breath caught in my throat. It was him. He had said it, the same whisper I had heard earlier. It wasn't just in my head. I didn't know what to do. I felt like I was suffocating. My hands clenched around my coffee cup as I watched him walk out of the cafe, the door jingling as he left. My mind was racing. Should I follow him? Should I call someone? I couldn't think clearly. My thoughts were a blur of fear and confusion. I stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over my chair. I couldn't stay there, not now, not with the knowledge that someone was watching me, someone who knew things about me that no one should know. I paid for my coffee and rushed outside, looking frantically for the man, but he was gone. The street was empty again. Except there was something. A shadow moving quickly down the alley just to the side of the cafe. I hesitated for only a second before my feet carried me forward, against every instinct telling me to turn around and run in the opposite direction. I didn't know what would happen if I followed him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to know. I had to confront this. The alley was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of streetlights at either end. The sound of my footsteps echoed off the walls, louder than I would have liked, making my nerves tighten with every step. I glanced over my shoulder. No one was following me, but that didn't reassure me. I felt watched, like something or someone was just out of sight, waiting. I approached the corner where the shadow had vanished. The air was thick, almost oppressive, as if the night itself was holding its breath. There was no sign of the man, no trace of where he had gone. The alley was just a stretch of empty pavement, littered with forgotten wrappers and damp leaves. But then I saw it. A door. A rusted, unmarked door at the far end of the alley, partly hidden behind a large trash bin. It wasn't the kind of door you would expect to find in the middle of a city block, especially not one that led to an alley like this. It looked old, out of place, like it had been forgotten by time itself. A shiver ran down my spine. I didn't know why, but I felt drawn to it, as if some invisible force was pulling me toward it. I approached the door cautiously, my breath shallow, my heart racing. It was locked. But it didn't feel locked. The door had an unusual give to it, like it could be opened with the slightest push. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. What if it was a trap? What if I was walking right into something I wouldn't be able to escape? But then, a thought crossed my mind. What if it was the only way to understand what was happening? I pushed the door open, slowly, the rusty hinges creaking in protest. The sound felt deafening in the silence of the alley. Inside was a small room. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, all stacked haphazardly, some overflowing with papers, others standing crooked and barely hanging together. The room smelled musty, a mix of dust and old wood. A single dim bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a weak light that barely reached the far corners. I stepped inside, the door shutting softly behind me. My breath came out in quick, shallow bursts as I scanned the room. It looked like an old storage space, nothing special. But then, I noticed something strange. There was a desk in the corner, cluttered with papers, and on top of the desk sat a single item, a pair of headphones. My stomach dropped. Headphones? The same type I had been wearing earlier when I heard the whisper. I felt a wave of unease wash over me, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. It was as if something, or someone, was telling me to pick them up, to put them on. I crossed the room slowly, my hand trembling as I reached for the headphones. As soon as my fingers touched them, I heard it. The faintest whisper, just like before, but this time it was louder, clearer. Olivia, it's time to listen. I yanked my hand back, startled. The whispering voice felt too real, too close. But the room was empty. I turned in a circle, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it, but deep down I knew better. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. The walls seemed to close in, the room stretching and shrinking in a disorienting dance. I had to get out of here. I stumbled toward the door, but as I reached for the handle, something stopped me. A piece of paper, half hidden under one of the filing cabinets, caught my attention. I bent down, my fingers brushing the edge of it. The paper was old, yellowed with age, and the handwriting was barely legible. But one word stood out clearly: Olivia. I pulled the paper out, heart pounding in my chest. It was a letter. A report. But the words on it made no sense. It was filled with strange phrases, disjointed sentences, all referring to a project, a procedure, and me. There was a mention of my name, Olivia Thompson, and an entry about subject observation. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the rest of the paper. It detailed events, but in the present tense, events that were happening right now, things that had been happening to me. It has begun. Olivia will be in the system soon. The process will be irreversible. I froze, the words blurring in front of my eyes. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. But the evidence was clear. Someone had been watching me. They knew everything. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. A soft shuffle, a scrape of shoes on the concrete floor. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. The room was empty again. The whispering had stopped, and all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat. But the door that had been open when I entered, was now closed. My breath caught in my throat. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, panic rising in my chest as I realized I was locked inside. And then, from the darkness, a voice spoke again, this time clearer than ever. Olivia, we've been waiting for you. The voice sent a chill down my spine as the room seemed to close in on me. I wasn't alone anymore. I wasn't alone at all. The air grew thick and suffocating, as though the room itself was closing in, smothering me with its presence. My heart pounded in my chest, my palms slick with sweat as I stared at the door, now solidly closed. There was no way out. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in from all sides. We've been waiting for you. The voice, so calm and yet chilling, echoed in my ears. It wasn't coming from the headphones anymore, it was in the room, all around me. The whisper had become louder, more distinct, as if a dozen voices were speaking in unison. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I turned slowly, searching the room for any sign of movement, any clue as to where the voices were coming from. But there was nothing, just the flickering light above, the cluttered filing cabinets, and that awful, oppressive silence. Then the whispers started to shape words, though they weren't entirely clear. You were part of the process. You always were. It was only a matter of time. The words twisted in my mind. The process? What did that mean? What had I gotten myself involved in? My thoughts spun in a dizzying blur, trying to piece together the fragments of what had been happening to me. The headphones, the whispers, the reports. All of it felt like a puzzle I was failing to solve. I took a step back, my eyes fixed on the desk. The headphones still sat there, untouched, as though mocking me. Olivia. The voice spoke my name again, this time soft, but commanding. I couldn't take it anymore. My legs trembled beneath me, and I backed away from the desk. The whispers swirled around me, gaining in intensity, building to a maddening crescendo. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block them out, but it was useless. The sound was inside my head. It was coming from every direction. Listen to us. Listen to what's next. The walls seemed to shift. The room felt like it was expanding and contracting, bending under some unseen force. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, the air growing colder, as though the temperature had dropped by several degrees in an instant. I stumbled toward the filing cabinets, desperate for something, anything, to explain what was happening. My eyes scanned the papers, the reports, the files scattered on the desk. One paper caught my attention. It was different from the others. It was a photograph. A photo of me. I gasped, reaching for the photograph. My fingers shook as I picked it up. There I was, sitting at a desk, smiling, looking exactly the same as I did now. But the date written on the back made my blood run cold. 5 years ago. There was something wrong. Something horribly wrong. The photo was not just a snapshot of a happy memory. It was a clue. A piece of the puzzle. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. It's time, Olivia. It's time for you to understand. The edges of my vision blurred, the room darkening. I could feel the ground beneath me shift. I reached for the desk, gripping it for support, but the desk suddenly jerked away from my grasp. In that moment, everything clicked into place. This wasn't just an office. This wasn't just a random room. This was a part of something larger. A system. A cycle that had been going on far longer than I had realized. The whispering voices were not random, they were a part of it. Part of the process. And I was part of the process too. I could feel it now, the unmistakable presence of something ancient and powerful. Something that had been watching me, waiting for me to uncover the truth. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't breathe. The air had turned thick, suffocating, and the whispers had become a chorus that drowned out everything else. I couldn't see, I couldn't think, only the voices remained, pulling me deeper into the darkness. The last thing I heard before everything went silent was the unmistakable sound of headphones clicking into place. And then, nothing. The next morning, they found me slumped in the corner of the room. My eyes were wide, fixed on the photograph, and my fingers clutched the desk in an unyielding grip. I had survived, but not unchanged. Have you ever had one of those days where everything seems to go wrong? The kind where the universe just feels like it's working against you, making sure you miss every opportunity? It was one of those mornings for me. I had woken up late, of course, and the clock on my phone showed that I had exactly 5 minutes to get to the bus stop. No time to grab breakfast, no time to shower. Just a mad dash to catch the bus that I always take to work. I threw on my jacket, grabbed my bag, and ran out the door, my heart pounding in my chest. My sneakers slapped against the pavement as I pushed myself harder, faster, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I could make it. But when I reached the corner, I saw the bus in the distance, pulling away. My stomach sank. It was always that bus, the same one, at the same time, every morning. I cursed under my breath, but there was nothing I could do. The bus was already gone, disappearing into the sea of morning traffic. I checked my watch, still 5 minutes until the next one. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but the frustration lingered in my chest. I wasn't usually one to panic. I could handle missing a bus. But today felt different. Maybe it was the weight of the week, or maybe it was the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. I waited, standing in the cold, watching the cars pass by, their exhaust fumes curling up into the crisp morning air. I tried to shake off the sense of dread that was creeping up on me, but it stayed. There was a low hum of anxiety building inside me. The second bus finally came, and I climbed aboard, finding an empty seat near the back. The bus was almost empty, save for a few other commuters. I sat down, letting out a sigh as I settled in. I pulled out my phone, checking my email and scrolling through social media to distract myself. But then something strange happened. As the bus pulled away from the stop, I glanced out the window at the passing streets. And that's when I saw it. The bus I had missed, the one I always took, was stuck in traffic a few blocks away. It was an odd sight, considering that the route I had taken wasn't typically delayed. It had always been punctual, reliable. And yet, there it was, idling, its hazard lights blinking. The vehicles in front of it were at a standstill. My heart skipped a beat. I turned my gaze back to the road ahead, trying to push the thought from my mind. It was nothing, I told myself. Just a coincidence. But as the minutes passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I glanced at the other passengers on the bus, but they were all engrossed in their own worlds. Nobody seemed to notice the strange tension hanging in the air. The humming in my chest had grown louder, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I couldn't help myself. I pulled out my phone again and checked the news. That's when I saw the headline. Fatal accident involving bus on Route 32. My blood ran cold. I clicked on the article, my fingers shaking as I read the details. The bus I had missed had been involved in a collision. Several people were injured, some critically. The report didn't give many details, but it was enough. My stomach twisted in knots. If I had been on that bus, I could have been one of them. I looked out the window again, my eyes searching for something to make sense of it. The second bus kept moving, and yet the sense of unease lingered, growing with each passing moment. The world outside seemed to be slipping into a strange stillness, as though time was moving differently. I checked the time on my phone, but the seconds seemed to drag on unnaturally. The usual noises of the city, the hum of traffic, the chatter of people, seemed muffled, like they were coming from a distant world. I glanced back at the clock. It had barely been 5 minutes since I had gotten on this bus, and yet it felt like I had been riding it for hours. And then the bus jerked to a stop. I looked up, confused, as the driver's voice crackled over the intercom, though his words were muffled and hard to make out. I could barely hear him above the sound of my own heartbeat. When the doors opened, I stepped off the bus, my legs shaky, my mind racing. I couldn't understand why I was feeling this way. But something told me that whatever had just happened, it wasn't over. Something else was coming. The moment I stepped off the bus, the unsettling feeling deepened. My surroundings seemed different, though nothing had changed. The street I was on should have looked the same, familiar, ordinary, but it didn't. The sounds of the city felt distant, muffled as though they were trapped behind a thick glass wall. Even the air felt heavier, colder. I turned to look at the bus as it pulled away, the large yellow vehicle blending into the busy morning traffic, but it didn't fade away like it should have. The bus seemed to linger in my mind, a constant presence, like it was pulling me deeper into something I couldn't quite understand. The streets ahead were quieter than usual. People hurried along the sidewalks, but there was something almost mechanical in their movements. Their faces were blank, their eyes fixed on the ground, as if they didn't see the world around them. I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts swirling in my mind. I couldn't focus. I had to get to work, put the weirdness out of my head. But the nagging feeling only grew stronger. Something wasn't right. As I walked to the office, I kept glancing back over my shoulder, half expecting to see the bus, my bus, the one I had missed, waiting at the corner, or maybe just idling somewhere ahead. But there was no sign of it. The streets were empty, quiet, as if everything had been paused for a moment. When I reached the office, I was still shaken, but I tried to push it aside. I greeted a few coworkers, tried to act normal, but every small noise seemed to echo in my ears. The rustle of papers, the hum of the fluorescent lights above, the faint murmur of conversations, it all felt off, as if the world around me was growing more distant with every passing second. I sat at my desk, but my mind kept drifting back to the news article I had read earlier. Fatal accident. The words echoed in my mind, replaying over and over again. How had I missed it? Why hadn't I been on that bus? Was it just luck? Or something else? I tried to focus on my work, but the unease lingered like a shadow, creeping into my thoughts. I checked the time, but it didn't feel like it was moving forward. The clock on my computer screen seemed stuck, the minutes stretching unnaturally. And then I heard it. A whisper. It was soft at first, barely audible, like a faint breath against my ear. I froze. I glanced around. No one seemed to notice. The office was as quiet as ever, the hum of the computer screens the only sound. But the whisper came again, louder this time. It's not over. My heart skipped a beat. My breath caught in my throat. I turned quickly to my side, expecting to see someone standing there, maybe one of my coworkers playing a joke. But no one was there. My desk was empty. I looked around the room, my eyes scanning for any sign of movement. But everyone was focused on their screens, oblivious to me. The whisper came again, and this time I realized it wasn't coming from the room. It was coming from inside my head. It's not over. My mind raced. My hands trembled as I tried to steady myself. I gripped the edge of my desk, staring at the screen in front of me, but it was hard to focus. The words felt real, like a cold breath against my skin. I pulled my earbuds out of my bag, wanting to drown out the strange sensation that was building. I plugged them into my phone and scrolled through my music, needing something to block out the eerie feeling. But when the music started, the whisper came again, unmistakable, even over the sound of the song. It's not over. I yanked the earbuds out, my heart pounding. The silence in the office was suffocating. My breath was ragged, and I could feel the walls closing in around me. My phone's screen was still lit, the music paused, yet the whisper lingered, like an echo that wouldn't fade. I could no longer ignore it. Something was happening, something I couldn't explain. I left my desk, walking quickly toward the break room. I needed space. I needed to breathe. But as I passed the hallway, I stopped dead in my tracks. I saw a glimpse of something. A reflection. In the glass of the hallway door, I saw my own reflection staring back at me, but it wasn't me. It was a version of me, standing still, eyes wide open, staring directly into my eyes with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I reached for the door, but as I did, my reflection slowly grinned. A cold shiver ran down my spine. This wasn't possible. There was no way. I yanked the door open and stumbled into the break room, my mind racing. I had to get out of here. I had to leave. But as I looked around the break room, the feeling only deepened. I was not alone. I stood in the break room, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The faint hum of the refrigerator in the corner seemed to grow louder, the sound of the coffee machine dripping water into the pot echoing like thunder in the stillness. I glanced around, but no one else was there. The room felt cold, the air thick with something I couldn't place. Then, the door behind me clicked softly, as if someone had entered. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest, but there was no one there. Only the faint reflection of myself in the polished glass door, still and unmoving. I quickly shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my thoughts. It had to be the stress. Maybe I was overthinking it. But something felt off. Deep down, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I walked to the counter, grabbed a cup from the shelf, and filled it with water, trying to steady my hands. But when I turned back toward the door, I saw it. A shadow. The shadow didn't belong. It wasn't part of the natural light from the windows, nor was it from the flickering overhead lights. It was darker, deeper than the usual shadows. It stretched unnaturally, like a presence waiting, lingering. I stared at it, frozen. It seemed to move, inching closer, though the room itself was empty. No, this can't be real. I quickly stepped back, my pulse quickening. The shadow followed, as if it were tethered to me. It crept along the floor, inching toward the doorway, stretching further with each step I took. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing denser with each passing moment. My vision blurred, my thoughts disoriented by the growing pressure of the room. I could feel my heart in my throat now, the panic rising, but I couldn't look away. I didn't want to look away. I was locked in place, drawn into the dark, the pull of the unknown far too strong. Suddenly, there was a soft scraping sound from behind me, like something dragging along the floor. My body tensed, every muscle screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. The whisper came again, louder now, like a breath on the back of my neck. It's not over. I flinched. The voice was different this time, no longer the soft murmur from earlier. It was closer now, like someone standing right behind me. I turned, my head snapping toward the sound, but the room was still empty. The shadow was gone, vanished as if it had never been there. The break room looked normal again, just like it always had. But the unease didn't leave. It lingered, pressing against my chest like a weight. The air felt thick with something waiting. I swallowed hard, stepping toward the door. I had to get out. I had to leave this place before it drove me insane. But as I reached for the handle, something stopped me. A tap. Soft. Deliberate. It came from inside the break room, from the corner by the refrigerator. A faint tap, like a fingernail against wood, then another and another. I froze. My hand on the door handle was cold with sweat. My heart raced in my chest. The tapping grew faster, more urgent, and I could feel it vibrating through my bones. Each tap sent a shiver down my spine, a warning. Don't leave. The voice wasn't mine. I spun around, wide-eyed. The room was empty again. But the tapping didn't stop. It was as if the walls were alive, pulsating with an energy I couldn't see. It was in my head, in my bones, too real to ignore. I turned the handle and threw open the door, stumbling out into the hallway, desperate to escape the room that seemed to want to trap me. The sounds followed me, distant but growing louder. The tapping. The whispering. It's not over. I broke into a run. I didn't look back. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, its fluorescent lights flickering in time with my erratic steps. I pushed open the office door, nearly colliding with a coworker who was walking by. "Hey, are you all right?" he asked, concern in his eyes. I tried to speak, to tell him what had happened, but the words caught in my throat. I shook my head, not trusting myself to explain. The air in the office felt normal again, the hum of the machines, the soft chatter of coworkers. But something in my gut told me this wasn't over. That feeling in the break room had followed me. I glanced at the clock. The time had stopped again, just like it had earlier. The seconds didn't move. The world seemed to be stuck in a loop, a moment frozen in time. And then, the door behind me opened. I spun around. It was my bus. The one I had missed. It was waiting outside. I froze. I had never seen it stop there before. The bus was at the wrong stop, but it was still there, and I could hear its engine humming, calling me back. My legs moved on their own, dragging me toward the door, toward the bus that shouldn't have been there. I had to get on. I didn't understand why, but I knew I had to. As I walked to the door, I glanced one last time at the clock. And then the door shut behind me, and everything went dark. I awoke with a start. My heart raced, and the lingering weight of the darkness pressed on my chest. For a moment, I was disoriented, unsure of where I was. The cold, metallic scent of the bus interior was the first thing to hit me. I blinked rapidly, trying to adjust to the dim lighting. The bus was moving, and I was sitting in one of the seats near the back, the same seat I would normally take, except something wasn't right. The bus was eerily quiet. No chatter from other passengers, no sounds of people getting on or off. Just the low hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the brakes. I looked around. There were people on the bus, but they were all unfamiliar. Their faces were blurry, like figures from a forgotten dream. None of them seemed to notice me. They were all staring straight ahead, unmoving, like mannequins frozen in place. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't my normal bus. I hadn't taken this route before. My mind raced, replaying the events from earlier. The break room, the tapping, the whispers, the voice that had warned me. It's not over. The voice echoed in my head, and my hands trembled as I gripped the armrests of my seat. I had to get off the bus. I couldn't stay here, not with this strange feeling clawing at my insides. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I stood up, moving quickly toward the front. The moment my feet hit the aisle, the bus seemed to lurch slightly, as if reacting to my movement. I glanced around, the passengers still motionless, as though they hadn't noticed me move at all. The driver, his face obscured by shadows, kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, not a single glance in my direction. "Excuse me," I said, my voice sounding strange in the heavy silence. It felt like the words were being swallowed by the air. "I need to get off. Please, stop the bus." There was no response. The bus kept moving, faster now, the world outside becoming a blur of lights and shadows. My stomach twisted as the feeling of unease grew stronger. The city streets outside were unfamiliar, and I couldn't make sense of the landscape. I tried the door. It wouldn't open. Panic surged through me. I turned to the driver, this time pounding on the window that separated us. "Please, stop the bus. Let me off." Still, there was no answer. He didn't even seem to hear me. The whisper returned. "It's not over." I spun around, my breath quickening. The passengers were still staring straight ahead, their eyes now completely vacant, their bodies stiff. It was as if they were all waiting for something, for me to realize something. I was the only one alive here, the only one aware. I stumbled back to my seat, sitting down hard, my mind reeling. I closed my eyes, trying to breathe through the panic, but the oppressive silence only deepened my fear. What was happening? What had happened to the people on the bus? Why were they all so still? The bus continued to speed through the city, its lights casting long, haunting shadows on the buildings we passed. The sound of the engine was the only thing that filled the space, but even that felt distorted, like a distant hum. Then, the lights flickered. And I heard it, the tapping again. Soft at first, like a distant footstep, but it grew louder with each passing second. I looked around, but no one seemed to notice. The tapping was coming from somewhere inside the bus, but there was no one there to make it. My heart raced. My hands clenched into fists, nails digging into my palms as the tapping grew louder and more frantic. The air felt thicker now, heavy with tension. I tried to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. The bus was no longer just moving, it was pulling me into something I couldn't escape. The walls seemed to close in, and the tapping was growing, becoming more aggressive. Then, the bus soared violently to the side. I was thrown against the window, my body slamming hard into the glass. I gasped for breath, my vision blurring as I tried to hold onto something, anything. The bus was careening out of control now, speeding up, the screech of tires filling the air. I could feel the weight of the metal frame bending, the bus twisting as it skidded along the road. I could see it now, out the window. The bus was heading straight for an intersection, but it wasn't stopping. I could see the cars coming toward us, the bright headlights blinding me. The tapping was deafening now, like 1,000 footsteps echoing in my ears. It was too late. The bus was going to crash. I braced for impact, but instead of the crash, the world seemed to pause. Everything slowed down, time itself frozen. And then, the world went black. I woke up with a start, gasping for air. My chest heaved as I struggled to shake the feeling of suffocating panic. For a long moment, I couldn't move, couldn't comprehend what had just happened. Was it a dream? I blinked, my surroundings coming into focus. The bus was no longer moving, and the flickering lights were gone. I was sitting in the same seat I had been in earlier, but this time everything was still. The other passengers, those mannequins, were gone, and the driver was nowhere to be seen. The world outside the window was unfamiliar. A deserted street, empty and silent. There were no cars, no people walking along the sidewalk. It was as if the city had been abandoned. I tried to speak, but my voice felt weak, as though it had been stripped of all strength. I stood up cautiously, the silence around me oppressive. The doors were still locked, and the air in the bus felt thick, stale. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. I had felt the bus crash, or maybe it was just the illusion of it, the certainty that I was about to die. But now, here I was, alive, sitting in a bus that felt like it had been abandoned for years. I glanced at the dashboard. The time was frozen, stuck on the same minute, the same second. I reached for my phone, but it was dead. Not just out of battery, but as though it had never worked at all. No signal, no network, no life in the device at all. My throat tightened as the full weight of the situation hit me. There was no escape from this place. No way out. I forced myself to move, walking down the aisle toward the front of the bus. My footsteps echoed loudly, the only sound in this dead world. I tried the doors again, but they refused to open. The windows were fogged, obscuring the view outside even further. I could feel my pulse quicken with each failed attempt to escape. As I stood there, trapped, I heard it again. The whisper. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more distinct. It was a voice, soft but clear, just behind me. You're not supposed to be here. I froze. The words sent a shiver down my spine. I knew that voice. Those words were the same ones I had heard earlier, the ones that had warned me while I was still in my apartment. But this time, it wasn't a whisper from the shadows. This time, the voice was in the air, surrounding me. I turned around slowly. There was no one there, no figure or presence to explain the voice. But I could feel it, a presence just beyond my reach, watching me. Waiting. You're not supposed to be here, the voice repeated, its tone growing darker. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced. What was happening to me? Was I losing my sanity? Or had I crossed some boundary I couldn't return from? Then, the doors of the bus creaked open. I hadn't touched them, hadn't done anything to trigger the release. They just opened, as though something had allowed them to do so. I stood there, staring at the gap in the door, the unknown world outside beckoning me. The whispering voice continued to echo in my ears, now more insistent, more demanding. It was as if the bus itself was alive, and it was trying to communicate with me. Get off, the voice hissed. Now. Without thinking, my legs moved. It wasn't my choice anymore. I was being pulled, dragged by an invisible force toward the open door. My mind screamed for me to stop, to stay, but my body had already made its decision. I stepped off the bus. The moment my feet hit the ground, the world around me shifted. The empty street became a blur of distorted shapes and shadows. I blinked, but the vision wouldn't clear. The buildings loomed over me, too tall, too narrow. The air was thick, stifling, pressing in from all sides. The ground beneath my feet felt unstable, like I was walking on a shifting surface. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Then, I heard the bus. The unmistakable hum of the engine, the screech of the brakes. It was moving, but it wasn't going anywhere. It was circling, like a predator trapped in its own cage, watching, waiting for me to make the next move. And then, I saw it, an image in the distance, a flash of something familiar. A figure, standing in the shadows, just at the edge of the street. My heart skipped a beat. It was me. The figure was an exact copy of myself, standing perfectly still, staring back at me. It wasn't a reflection, it was real, flesh and bone, staring with eyes full of cold emptiness. I took a step backward, but my feet felt heavy. My legs wouldn't respond. The figure began to move toward me, slowly, deliberately. You're not supposed to be here, it whispered, its voice just like mine. The ground shifted beneath me, the world collapsing in on itself. I closed my eyes, but the last thing I heard before the darkness took me was the sound of the bus, still circling, still waiting. Have you ever felt like someone was talking about you behind your back, but louder than whispers and just soft enough to keep you doubting? That's what happened to me on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. The cafe on Maple Street was my usual escape from the monotony of office life. A corner table, a laptop, and the comforting hum of muted conversations created the perfect backdrop for catching up on reports. I had been there for nearly an hour, nursing a lukewarm espresso and staring at an email I couldn't bring myself to finish. It began as an ordinary buzz of conversation, indistinct words mixing with the clatter of cups and the low hum of the espresso machine. Then, like a spotlight in the dark, certain phrases reached me, cutting through the noise. The system is vulnerable. It's not just about data anymore. I froze mid-typing, my fingers hovering above the keys. The words came from the table directly behind me. Did he suspect anything? A second voice asked, quieter but sharper. No, he's too busy crunching numbers to see what's happening beneath the surface, the first voice replied, tinged with amusement. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone. Casual, calculated, and oddly familiar. Something about the conversation hit too close to home. I tilted my head slightly, straining to catch more. Phase 2 starts tonight. He'll find out when it's too late, the second voice added. The chair creaked as I shifted, pretending to adjust my laptop. My mind raced. Was it about me? Could it just be a coincidence? I stole a glance behind me, careful not to make it obvious. 2 men sat at the table. One wore a crisp gray suit, his posture stiff, as though he belonged in a boardroom rather than a cozy cafe. The other, dressed casually in a navy hoodie, leaned forward, speaking in hushed tones. Neither looked familiar, but their words felt like a thread unraveling a sweater, pulling apart something I couldn't yet see. You're sure he doesn't know? Gray Suit asked, his voice barely audible. Positive. He has no idea what's coming, Hoodie replied, a sly smile curling his lips. I turned back to my laptop, my pulse quickening. I should have ignored them, written it off as paranoia. But their conversation mirrored too many details of a confidential project I've been working on, an analysis of potential breaches in the company's network. Coincidence wasn't enough to explain this. The air in the cafe felt heavier now, the once soothing hum of voices and machines feeding into an eerie quiet. Even the usual warmth of the sunlight filtering through the large windows seemed muted. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I decided to act casual, lifting my phone as if checking for messages, angling it to snap a quick picture of the 2 men in the reflection of the screen. My hands trembled slightly, but I managed to capture their blurred silhouettes. Just as I lowered the phone, the voices stopped. A silence hung in the air, dense and suffocating. I turned my head slightly, but they were still there, leaning closer, their words now too soft to hear. Then Gray Suit stood, pulling on his jacket in one smooth motion. Hoodie followed, their movements synchronized like a rehearsed routine. Panic bubbled in my chest. Should I confront them? Call someone? But who? What would I even say? As they moved toward the exit, Hoodie paused, turning his head slightly in my direction. For a brief moment, our eyes met. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of curiosity and amusement. I held my breath, my body rigid. Then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile, it was the kind of smile that sent a message. He knew. And then they were gone. I sat there for a moment, trying to collect my thoughts. My chest felt tight, my breath shallow. I grabbed my phone, intending to review the photo I'd taken. My screen was blank. No images, no gallery app, nothing. As if the photo, and every trace of my attempt to capture it, had been wiped clean. I stared at the screen, my pulse racing. The cafe, once a haven, now felt suffocating. Every face around me seemed unfamiliar, every sound a threat. The barista called out an order, the sound jolting me back to reality. My coffee sat cold, untouched. I stuffed my laptop into my bag and headed for the door, my mind replaying the words I had overheard. Phase 2 starts tonight. What was Phase 2? And why did it feel like it was meant for me? I stepped out of the cafe, my heart pounding like a drum. The crisp autumn air stung my cheeks, but the chill did nothing to clear the fog clouding my mind. Their words replayed in a relentless loop. Phase 2 starts tonight. I scanned the street, hoping to catch sight of the two men. Gray suit and hoodie were gone, lost in the sea of commuters bustling along the sidewalks. I debated chasing after them, but my instinct screamed that it would be a mistake. Instead, I turned toward my office. The company was only a few blocks away, but the short walk felt eternal. Every footstep behind me, every rustle of leaves, sent my senses into overdrive. When I arrived, the familiar sight of the glass and steel tower did little to comfort me. Inside, the usual hum of activity greeted me, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, conversations blending into an incoherent murmur. I headed straight to my desk, avoiding eye contact with anyone. My monitor blinked to life, and I opened the encrypted folder for the project. The analysis reports, logs, and security protocols stared back at me like an unfinished puzzle. I clicked through the files, looking for anything unusual, anything that might connect to what I'd overheard. My fingers trembled as I scrolled, and then I saw it. A timestamp. The log showed an unauthorized access attempt earlier that day. At precisely 10:15 a.m. someone had tried to breach the system, but the firewall had held. What's more unsettling, the attempt was traced back to an internal IP address. It was someone inside the company. I leaned back in my chair, my stomach twisting into knots. Was this what the two men in the cafe had been discussing? Could it have been a coincidence? No, the timing was too perfect. I decided to escalate it to IT security. Picking up the phone, I dialed the extension for Rick, the head of the department. "Hey, Rick." "It's me," I said, my voice strained. "There's something weird in the logs. Can you take a look?" "Sure, send it over," Rick replied casually, but there was a faint edge of concern in his tone. I forwarded the file, my hand shaking. A few minutes later, Rick called back. "You're right, this doesn't look good. The source is internal, but it's masked. Whoever did this knows what they're doing. I'll dig deeper and get back to you." His words offered little reassurance. Masked? Internal? My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. I tried to focus on other tasks, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the cafe. Who were those men? How did they know about this system's vulnerabilities? Hours passed, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the office began to empty. Rick hadn't called back. Unable to sit still, I grabbed my coat and headed to his office. The IT department was always dimly lit, the glow of monitors casting eerie shadows on the walls. Rick's desk was empty, his chair pushed back as if he'd left in a hurry. "Rick?" I called out, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet space. No answer. I noticed his monitor was still on, displaying a command prompt. Lines of code scrolled past, but before I could make sense of it, the screen flickered and went dark. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. A faint sound broke the silence, a soft shuffling, like footsteps. I turned, but the corridor was empty. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. The sound grew louder, closer. My pulse quickened as I backed toward the exit. Then the lights in the IT department flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a split second. When they came back on, a figure stood at the end of the corridor, silhouetted against the faint glow of the emergency exit sign. It wasn't Rick. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, the lights flickered again, and the figure was gone. I didn't wait to find out more. I bolted down the corridor, my footsteps echoing like gunshots in the empty space. My mind screamed at me to leave the building, but something compelled me to stay. I needed answers, but all I found were more questions. I burst out of the IT department, my breath ragged and uneven. The eerie silence of the empty office amplified every sound, the distant hum of the air conditioner, the occasional creak of the building settling. I couldn't shake the image of that shadowy figure. Who were they? And why were they there? I didn't have time to dwell. Rick was missing, and the logs hinted at something far deeper than a simple security breach. I decided to check the security room on the second floor. If anyone had been in the IT department, the cameras would have caught them. The elevator ride felt interminable, the faint elevator music doing little to soothe my nerves. When the doors finally slid open, I stepped into the dimly lit hallway. The security room was at the far end, its glass door frosted and locked with a keypad. I knocked, but there was no response. Great, I muttered, digging into my pocket for my access card. The scanner beeped, and the door clicked open. Inside, the room was a maze of monitors, each displaying different parts of the building. I scanned the screens quickly, searching for footage from the IT department. And then I saw it. On one of the smaller monitors, a timestamp showed footage from earlier in the evening. A figure entered the IT department, tall, wearing dark clothing, and moving with purpose. They weren't carrying anything visible, but their demeanor was deliberate, methodical. I rewound the footage, trying to catch their face, but they kept their head low, their features obscured. Frustrated, I fast-forwarded to the present. The live feed showed the IT department empty. No sign of Rick, no sign of the figure. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. But then something on the corner of another monitor caught my eye, a flicker of movement in the stairwell. It was the figure. They were ascending the stairs, moving swiftly but silently, and they were coming toward the second floor. Toward me. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my phone, dialing Rick's number again. "Come on, pick up," I whispered, the ringing in my ear growing louder with every passing second. No answer. I glanced back at the monitor. The figure was now at the landing, just a flight away. My pulse thundered in my ears as I debated my next move. I couldn't stay here. I slipped out of the security room, closing the door as quietly as possible. My only option was to get to the main floor and out of the building. My footsteps were cautious, measured, as I made my way to the stairwell. But when I reached the door, I froze. A shadow moved on the other side, blocking my escape route. I spun around, darting toward the elevator. The light above it showed it was on its way down. Down from the second floor. They were inside. I backed away, my mind racing. The only other option was the emergency exit on the far side of the building. I bolted, my heart hammering with every step. The hallways seemed endless, each corner a potential ambush. I glanced behind me, half expecting to see the figure closing in, but the space remained empty. I reached the emergency exit and pushed against the door. It resisted at first, then gave way with a loud metallic groan. The cool night air hit me like a splash of water, and I stumbled onto the fire escape. But as I descended the metal stairs, a sound stopped me in my tracks, a voice. Faint, distorted, and unmistakable. Phase 2 starts tonight. The same words I'd heard in the cafe. The voice wasn't coming from the building. It was coming from my phone. I stared at the screen, my hand trembling. The call was still connected to Rick's number. "Rick?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The line crackled with static, and then the voice came again, clearer this time. "You shouldn't have listened." I dropped the phone as if it had burned me, the sound echoing off the alley walls below. My mind reeled, torn between running and finding out who or what was behind this. The phone buzzed once more, vibrating against the metal steps. A notification lit up the screen. New message, meet us at midnight. You know where. The message felt like a trap. Every instinct screamed at me to delete it, throw the phone away, and forget everything. But I couldn't. Not after what I'd seen. Not after Rick had disappeared. You know where. The words pulsed in my mind. I stared at the screen, trying to piece it together. The cafe? It had to be. The place where this all started. But midnight was hours away, and the thought of waiting felt unbearable. My mind raced with questions and dread. Who were they? Why were they watching me? And what did Rick have to do with this? I picked up the phone, wiped the dirt off the screen, and headed home. If I was going to face whatever this was, I needed to think, to prepare. The hours ticked by painfully slowly. I couldn't sit still. My small apartment felt like a prison, the walls closing in with every passing minute. Every creak of the floorboards, every hum of the refrigerator made me jump. By 11:30, I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing my jacket, I slipped out the door and into the night. The city streets were eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're the last person alive. As I approached the cafe, a strange sense of déjà vu washed over me. The glow of the streetlights, the faint smell of roasted coffee beans, the distant hum of a passing car, it was all the same as before. But something was off. The cafe was closed, its lights dimmed. A faint flicker of neon from the sign buzzed above the entrance. Yet the door was ajar, a sliver of darkness inviting me in. I hesitated. My heart thudded against my ribs, my breathing shallow. You know where. I pushed the door open. The soft chime of the bell above the door was the only sound that greeted me. Inside, the cafe was empty. Chairs were stacked on tables, and the faint aroma of stale coffee lingered in the air. Hello? My voice echoed, small and uncertain. No response. I stepped further inside, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The darkness seemed to press in around me, heavy and suffocating. And then, I saw it. On the table where I had sat earlier that day, a small envelope lay waiting. My name was scrawled across it in bold, precise letters. My hands trembled as I picked it up, the paper cool and smooth against my fingertips. Inside was a single piece of paper with 3 words. Check the alley. My stomach twisted. I glanced toward the back of the cafe, where a narrow hallway led to the rear exit. The memory of the shadow in the stairwell came flooding back, and I had to steady myself against the table. But I had come this far. With slow, deliberate steps, I made my way to the alley door. The handle felt cold, almost icy, as I pushed it open. The alley was dark, illuminated only by a flickering street lamp at the far end. The air was thick, damp, and carried an unsettling stillness. Hello? I called again, my voice barely a whisper. A soft rustling sound came from the shadows. My eyes strained to adjust, searching for the source. And then, they stepped into the light. Two figures, dressed in black, their faces obscured by masks. They stood motionless, like statues, their presence radiating an unnerving calm. Before I could speak, one of them raised a gloved hand, pointing at me. "You've been chosen," a distorted voice said, its tone mechanical, inhuman. "Chosen for what?" I managed to croak, my throat dry. "To see the truth." The second figure stepped forward, holding out an object wrapped in cloth. They placed it on the ground between us and stepped back into the shadows. "Take it," the first voice commanded. My instinct screamed at me to run, to leave and never look back. But curiosity, or perhaps sheer terror, rooted me to the spot. I crouched down, my fingers hesitating over the bundle before unwrapping it. Inside was a small device, a flash drive, its sleek surface reflecting the dim light. "Plug it in," the voice continued, "and you'll understand." "What is this?" I demanded, my voice rising. But the alley was empty. The figures were gone, the air still once more. I clutched the flash drive, its weight feeling heavier than it should. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Back in my apartment, the flash drive sat on the desk like a ticking time bomb. The room felt suffocating, the walls pressing in on me as I stared at the device. "Plug it in," the voice had said. But what if it was a trap? What if this was the end of the line? I paced the floor, the weight of the night's events pulling at me. The masked figures, the cryptic words, Rick's disappearance, it all swirled in my mind like a storm. I couldn't run anymore. Whatever this was, I needed answers. With trembling hands, I plugged the flash drive into my laptop. The screen flickered to life, the usual icons replaced by a single black window. Initializing. The word blinked on the screen, the tension in the room palpable. A file appeared, labeled simply, "Truth." I clicked on it. The screen filled with video footage, grainy, black and white, but unmistakably clear in its intent. It showed the cafe, but from an angle I'd never seen before. It was surveillance footage. At first, everything looked normal. Patrons came and went, coffee was poured, conversations flowed. And then I saw myself, sitting at the table, sipping my coffee, oblivious to the world around me. I leaned closer, my heart pounding. The footage skipped forward, and the two figures appeared. They sat at the table behind me, their movements deliberate, as if they knew they were being watched. And then it happened. One of them leaned closer to the other, whispering something, and pointed directly at me. I froze. They were talking about me. The footage jumped again, this time showing me leaving the cafe. The camera followed the masked figures as they rose, gathered their things, and exited moments after me. My blood ran cold. I hadn't imagined it. They had been watching me, following me. But why? The video ended abruptly, replaced by a line of text on the screen. "They know you've seen too much. Run." The laptop powered down on its own, leaving me in darkness. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to process what I just witnessed. A loud knock shattered the silence. I spun around, staring at the door. Another knock, harder this time. "Mr. Brooks, open the door," a voice commanded. It was calm, authoritative, and utterly chilling. They had found me. I backed away, my mind racing. There was no time to think, only to act. Grabbing the laptop and the flash drive, I shoved them into my bag and bolted for the fire escape. The knocks turned into pounding, and I could hear the sound of wood splintering as they forced their way in. I climbed down the rickety metal stairs, my pulse hammering in my ears. The alley below was dark, but I didn't stop to look. I ran. The city blurred around me as I moved through streets and alleys, the weight of the flash drive pressing against me like a curse. Whoever these people were, they weren't going to let me walk away. But I couldn't stop now. The truth was out there, and I was the only one who could expose it. Or die trying. Have you ever felt the ground shift beneath you without moving a single step? That was the exact feeling I had as I stared at the bank screen, my chest tightening with disbelief. My account balance read 0. 0. The fluorescent lights in the bank buzzed faintly, a sound that felt deafening in the sudden silence of my thoughts. My name is Olivia Parker, and I'm meticulous when it comes to money. Every transaction logged, every expense tracked. So how could this be possible? "Excuse me," I said, my voice trembling as I waved down the nearest teller. A young man in a crisp blue shirt approached, his friendly smile faltering as he saw my expression. "How can I help you today?" he asked. "There must be some mistake," I said, gesturing to the screen. "My balance, it's gone. Every penny." He frowned and motioned for me to follow him to his desk. "Let's take a closer look." I handed over my ID, and he pulled up my account on his computer. His eyebrows knitted together as he scanned the screen. "Ms. Parker," he began cautiously, "there's no record of any withdrawals or transfers from your account." "That's impossible," I said, my voice rising. "Look again." He turned the monitor so I could see for myself. The transaction history was blank for the past week. No withdrawals. No deposits. Just nothing. My heart pounded as I clutched the edge of the desk. "Then where's my money?" The teller's face turned pale. I'm not sure," he admitted. "This doesn't make any sense. I'll escalate this to our manager immediately." He left to fetch the manager, leaving me alone in the sterile, air-conditioned silence. My mind raced. Had I been hacked? But wouldn't there be some trace of the transaction? A mistake by the bank? Unlikely, they thrived on precision. As the minutes stretched, I noticed something odd. The room felt colder, the hum of the lights sharper. The usual chatter of the bank seemed muffled, distant. I turned to look at the other customers, but no one was paying attention to me. It was as if I were invisible. The manager returned, an older woman with an air of authority, but her furrowed brow told me all I needed to know. "Ms. Parker," she began, her voice calm but strained, "we've reviewed your account, and there's no indication of any unauthorized activity. We'll conduct a thorough investigation, but for now..." "For now, what?" I snapped, frustration bubbling over. "My money is gone. We'll notify you as soon as we have any updates," she said, her tone professional yet hollow. Feeling helpless, I left the bank, clutching the receipt that showed my non-existent balance. The city streets were bustling as usual, but everything felt off-kilter. Every face seemed unfamiliar, every sound too sharp. That night, I barely slept. The absence of my money loomed over me like a specter, and every theory I conjured felt more absurd than the last. By morning, I resolved to call the bank again, but my phone rang first. "Ms. Parker," the voice on the other end said, "this is Emily from Downtown Bank. We're still investigating your case, but we've found something unusual." "What is it?" I demanded. "We checked our system logs," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "and it appears that your account was accessed. But the source is untraceable." It's as if she paused, choosing her words carefully. As if it didn't come from anywhere. The line went silent for a moment, save for her shallow breathing. "That doesn't make sense," I whispered. "I know," she replied. "But there's something else. At exactly 3:27 a.m., your account balance was restored. Every cent is back." I froze. "What?" "We have no explanation for this," Emily said. "We suggest monitoring your account closely and updating your security settings. If anything else happens, please let us know." The call ended, leaving me staring at my phone. My balance was back, but the questions it left behind felt far heavier. And I had a sinking feeling this was far from over. The relief of seeing my restored balance was fleeting. Something was deeply wrong. The first thing I did was check my account. Every cent was indeed back, down to the last decimal. But as I scrolled through the transaction history, a chill ran down my spine. A new entry appeared, timestamped 3:27 a.m., the exact time the bank had mentioned. Credit, $0. That made no sense. A credit of $0? Why would the system even register such a thing? The bank's app glitched as I stared at the entry, the screen flickering before going black. I tried reopening it, but the app crashed again and again. Frustrated, I grabbed my laptop, logging in through the website instead. The transaction history looked normal now, the strange credit entry gone. But the feeling of unease lingered. I closed the laptop, trying to push the nagging thoughts aside. By mid-afternoon, I decided to get out of the apartment, hoping some fresh air would clear my head. I stopped by a nearby cafe, ordered a coffee, and sat by the window, watching people pass by. My phone buzzed on the table. The notification wasn't from a contact or any app one recognized. It was just a number, -000-0000. I hesitated before opening it. The message contained only 2 words. "Watch closely." My pulse quickened as I looked around the cafe. Was someone watching me? The other patrons seemed absorbed in their own worlds, typing on laptops, scrolling on phones, chatting over lattes. None of them seemed out of place, but that only heightened my paranoia. Another buzz. This time, it was a notification from my banking app. Heart pounding, I opened it. My balance had changed again, but not in the way I expected. It now read, $1. A single dollar. I stared at the screen, my thoughts racing. How could this happen again? Before I could react, another message appeared. Check the receipt. My coffee receipt lay crumpled on the table. Shaking, I smoothed it out. There, at the bottom of the slip, were the same 2 words from the text. Watch closely. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor, drawing the attention of the other customers. Ignoring their curious looks, I shoved the receipt into my bag and left the cafe. Outside, the streets felt oppressive, the once familiar sounds of the city now distorted and jarring. I pulled out my phone to call the bank again, but before I could dial, another notification flashed on the screen. Don't call them. My breath hitched. Whoever, or whatever, this was, they were one step ahead of me. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I saw nothing but the usual hustle and bustle of the city. Yet the sensation lingered, a heavy weight pressing on my chest. That night, as I lay in bed, the exhaustion of the day finally caught up with me. My phone buzzed one last time. The message was different this time. It wasn't a warning, but a question. Do you want to know the truth? I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I typed a single word in response, yes. The reply came instantly. Then be ready. Tomorrow, 3:27 a.m. I didn't sleep that night. 3:27 a.m. The clock glowed faintly in the darkness of my room. Each passing minute felt like an eternity. Despite the exhaustion from a sleepless night, my mind remained sharp, brimming with questions and fear. I sat at my desk, the phone resting in front of me. Its screen was dark, but I knew it wouldn't be for long. As the digital clock ticked to 3:27, the phone buzzed. A single message appeared. Open your door. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The door to my apartment was deadbolt, yet the thought of someone or something waiting on the other side sent a chill through me. I hesitated. My hands trembled as I typed a response. Who are you? No reply. The phone remained silent. Another buzz. This time, it wasn't a message. It was my door. A soft knock. I froze, staring at the entrance to my apartment. The knock came again, louder this time, insistent. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay put, I stood and approached the door. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing. The hallway outside was empty, dimly lit by the flickering bulb that had been faulty for weeks. The knocking stopped. My phone buzzed again. Open it now, or the opportunity will pass. With a deep breath, I unbolted the door and opened it. The hallway was empty. No shadowy figures, no lurking presence, just the silence of the early morning. But as I looked down, I saw an envelope lying on the floor. My name was scrawled across it in jagged handwriting. I picked it up and shut the door quickly, locking it behind me. My heart raced as I opened the envelope and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. It was a map. The crude sketch showed a part of the city I recognized, the industrial district, specifically an old, abandoned warehouse near the river. A red X marked one of the buildings. Below the map were 2 words. Come alone. I dropped the paper on the table, pacing the room. This was insane. What was waiting for me there? Who was behind this? Every logical part of me screamed to ignore it, to go to the police, to block whatever entity was contacting me. But a stronger force, a gnawing curiosity, kept me from doing so. I glanced at the clock. 3:45 a.m. If I left now, I could make it there by 4. Without allowing myself time to overthink, I grabbed my coat, slipped the map into my pocket, and stepped into the cold night. The streets were eerily quiet. The industrial district had always been desolate after hours, but tonight it felt otherworldly. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound amplified. The warehouse loomed ahead, its silhouette jagged against the moonlit sky. The building was long abandoned, its windows shattered and walls covered in graffiti. Yet, as I approached, I noticed something strange. A faint light glowed from inside. I hesitated at the entrance, my breath visible in the icy air. The massive door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing into the cavernous space. Inside, the light came from a single bulb dangling from the ceiling, swaying slightly. Beneath it stood a figure. They were cloaked in shadows, their features obscured by the dim light. Who are you? I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, they held out something, a small device, like an old cassette recorder. They pressed play. A distorted voice filled the room, static crackling around the words. "You've been chosen." "Chosen for what?" I asked, taking a cautious step forward. The figure tilted their head, as if considering the question. The voice on the tape continued. "You were supposed to be on the bus." I froze. My heart raced as memories of the crash flooded back. "What do you mean? Why does this involve me?" The figure pressed stop on the recorder, then pointed toward a table nearby. On it sat a single item, a folder. I approached slowly, my eyes never leaving the figure. The folder was labeled with my name. Opening it, I found photos of me. Walking to work, sitting in the cafe, standing in my apartment. Each shot was dated, spanning the past month. "Why are you doing this?" My voice cracked. The figure finally spoke, their voice low and mechanical, like it was being modulated. "You survived when you shouldn't have." I stepped back, the folder slipping from my hands. "Why? What do you mean?" They didn't answer. Instead, they reached into their pocket, pulling out a card and handing it to me. It bore a single sentence. "It's not over." Before I could react, the light flickered and went out. Darkness enveloped the room. When the light returned, the figure was gone. The walk back to my apartment was a blur. My mind raced, grappling with the folder, the photos, the voice, and the words that haunted me. "You survived when you shouldn't have." Who were they? What did they mean? And why was I being watched? I locked my apartment door behind me, every sound in the hallway sending a spike of paranoia through my chest. I double-checked the locks, then collapsed into the chair at my desk. The folder lay in front of me. My shaking hands opened it once more. There was a pattern to the photos. They weren't random moments, but specific instances, places where I had lingered longer than usual, or where I had felt uneasy, like someone was watching. My phone buzzed again. The number was still unknown. This time, there was no message, just a single attachment, an audio file. I hesitated, staring at the screen. The title of the file was chillingly simple, "Play Me." I plugged in my headphones, every instinct screaming not to, but I had to know. The file started with static, then a voice emerged, a distorted whisper, eerily similar to the one from the warehouse. "Do you remember the decision?" "What decision?" I whispered aloud, though no one was there to answer. The voice continued. 2 months ago. The crosswalk." My breath caught. The crosswalk. It was raining that day, the streets slick with water. I had been late for a meeting and barely looked as I stepped into the road. A car sped toward me. I froze. But at the last second, someone had grabbed my arm and pulled me back onto the curb. A stranger, an older man in a dark coat. "You're lucky," he had said, his voice gruff. Then he disappeared into the crowd. The audio file crackled again. That moment should have been the end. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "It can't be." The voice grew louder, angrier. "You don't understand the cost of survival." The balance was broken. And now, others will pay. The file ended abruptly, leaving me in silence. The next day, I couldn't focus. Every sound felt amplified, every person in the street a potential threat. I avoided the bus, choosing instead to walk to work, but my paranoia only deepened with each step. At work, I avoided my colleagues' questions. My eyes darted to every shadow, my mind replaying the voice's words, "Others will pay." At lunch, I sat in the cafe where I had first noticed the stranger watching me. As I stirred my coffee, I noticed a man at the corner table. He wasn't eating or drinking, just sitting there, watching. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. His gaze didn't waver. I left the cafe and turned onto the main street, my pulse pounding in my ears. I glanced behind me. The man was following. That evening, the photos in the folder took on new meaning. One, in particular, caught my attention. It showed a woman, a stranger, crossing a street. The angle suggested it was taken from a distance, possibly from inside a car. Her face was frozen in a moment of fear, her eyes locked on something out of frame. On the back of the photo, a date was scrawled, "Tomorrow." My stomach churned. Was she the next target? Would this balance claim her as part of the price for my survival? I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I stared at the photo, the woman's face burned into my memory. I had no idea who she was or how to find her, but I knew one thing: I couldn't just sit and do nothing. If my survival had put her in danger, I had to stop it. As dawn broke, I grabbed the folder and headed out, the weight of the unknown heavy on my shoulders. The city felt eerily quiet as I stepped out into the early morning light. The streets were damp from a night of rain, and the air carried a tense stillness. The photo of the woman with the date tomorrow was clutched tightly in my hand. How was I supposed to find her? I took the bus for the first time in days, scanning every face as I boarded. My paranoia heightened with each stop. No one seemed out of place, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The bus route led me toward the intersection I had nearly died at months ago, the crosswalk where the stranger had pulled me back. It wasn't a coincidence, it couldn't be. As I approached the intersection, I saw her. The woman from the photo. She stood at the curb, clutching a bag and checking her phone. She looked so ordinary, so unaware of the danger that surrounded her. And then, I saw the car. It was idling further down the street, its engine humming faintly in the cool morning air. The driver's window was rolled down just enough for me to see a shadowed figure inside. My instinct screamed ATI across the street toward her, forcing myself to stay calm despite the pounding in my chest. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaky. She looked up, startled. "Yes?" I hesitated, unsure how to explain without sounding insane. "I think you're in danger. You need to leave this area." Her brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" I glanced over my shoulder. The car had started moving slowly down the street, creeping toward us like a predator stalking its prey. "Please," I urged. "Just trust me. Walk away. Now." She hesitated, then stepped back, her eyes darting toward the approaching car. Perhaps she saw the fear in my face or the urgency in my voice, because she turned and began walking quickly in the opposite direction. The car speeded up. I didn't think, I ran after it. The driver must have seen me in the rearview mirror because the car screeched to a halt. The door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, his face obscured by a hood. "You shouldn't have interfered," he said, his voice low and menacing. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The man took a step closer, his presence suffocating. "This was never about what you want. It's about what you owe." I took a step back, glancing toward the crosswalk. The woman was gone. For a moment, relief flooded me. She was safe, for now. But the man wasn't finished. "You cheated death," he said, his voice cold. "And now, others must pay the price." I shook my head. "No. I didn't ask for this. I didn't choose to survive." His gaze pierced through me. "It doesn't matter. The balance demands payment. If not her, then someone else." Before I could respond, he moved. It wasn't natural. He seemed to glide more than walk, closing the distance between us in an instant. I turned and ran. My heart thundered as I sprinted through the streets, weaving between early morning pedestrians who gave me strange looks. I didn't care. I could hear his footsteps behind me, steady, relentless. I ducked into an alley, hoping to lose him, but when I looked back, he was still there, his figure silhouetted against the dim light. There was no escape. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath, he was gone. The silence was deafening. The only sound was the distant hum of the city waking up. I stumbled back onto the main street, my legs trembling. The woman was gone, and so was the car. But I knew this wasn't over. The balance wasn't restored. The debt hadn't been paid. And I was still a part of the equation. That night, I returned to my apartment, the folder still clutched in my hands. I flipped through the photos again, searching for answers. At the very back of the folder was a new photo. It was of me, taken that very morning. On the back, a single word was written, "Soon." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't just a survivor. I was a target. And the game wasn't over yet. Me to act. Have you ever received an invitation for something you've never asked for? Something that seems harmless at first, yet gnaws at you with a sense of unease? It started like any other Tuesday morning. I was sipping my coffee, scrolling through emails, when one subject line caught my attention. It read, "Exclusive photo shoot invitation, limited spots." I didn't recognize the sender, but the email seemed legitimate. No strange fonts, no suspicious attachments. Just a professional-looking invitation with a bold image of a camera and the words "Be the face of our next project." The email went on to describe a photo shoot happening the following weekend at a confidential location. The shoot promised to showcase unique and powerful portraits with a special focus on capturing your essence. It seemed too good to pass up. I had never been involved in anything like this before, but I had always loved photography and thought it would be an interesting experience. I hesitated for only a moment before clicking the RSVP button. The confirmation email arrived instantly, and within seconds, I had the address and a time for the shoot. The location was a building I vaguely recognized, one of those older, almost forgotten structures on the edge of town. Not the kind of place you'd expect a glamorous photo shoot to take place. Still, my curiosity got the best of me. I arrived early, eager but nervous. The building was just as I remembered, run down and in need of a fresh coat of paint. It had a strange charm to it, though, with its tall windows and cracked stone exterior. As I entered, the scent of dust and stale air greeted me. The lobby was bare except for a few chairs against the wall. I checked the address on my phone again. This was definitely the right place. A man appeared in the doorway, dressed in black, with a calm, almost too perfect smile. "Welcome," he said, his voice smooth and welcoming. "I'm Ian, the photographer. Please, follow me. I nodded, trying to mask my growing unease. Something about his demeanor felt off, but I couldn't pinpoint why. As we made our way down a narrow corridor, the building seemed to get darker. The walls closed in, and the sound of our footsteps echoed eerily. My senses heightened. There was no music or chatter like I'd imagined a photo shoot would have. Just silence. We reached a door at the end of the hallway. Ian opened it, revealing a small, dimly lit studio. "Please, make yourself comfortable," he said, gesturing to a chair in front of a large backdrop. The backdrop was a strange abstract pattern, swirling in shades of blue and gray, almost hypnotic in its motion. I hesitated for only a moment before sitting down. The seat felt cold against my legs, and the silence in the room thickened. Ian went behind the camera, adjusting settings without speaking. I tried to settle into the seat, but something didn't feel right. I couldn't place it, but I felt exposed. As the camera clicked, I noticed something odd. I wasn't looking directly at the camera anymore. It wasn't the reflection in the lens that I was seeing. No, the reflection was of a different place entirely, a vast empty field covered in fog. My heart skipped a beat. The click of the camera snapped me back to reality. I blinked, trying to clear my mind, but the image of the foggy field lingered in my vision. "Relax," Ian's voice broke through. "Just a few more shots." I nodded, but my heart was racing. My hands trembled slightly as I clutched the edge of the chair. The flashes continued, and each time I felt more and more detached. The world around me seemed to blur, becoming less tangible. When the shoot finally ended, Ian gave me a polite nod. "Thank you for your time. Your photos will be sent to you soon." I left the building feeling more unsettled than I had ever been. The streets outside were busy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Back home, I sank onto the couch, unable to focus on anything else. The photo was supposed to be a simple memory, but something about it was off. I pulled up the email and clicked on the link to view my photos. The first image froze me in place. It wasn't me. The woman in the photo had my face, but her features were sharper, her expression colder. Her eyes were empty, as if the soul had been drained from her. The background of the image, it wasn't the studio. It was that same foggy field. I clicked to the next photo. And the next. Each one was more distorted than the last. The last image was a portrait, a close-up of my face, but it was no longer recognizable. The skin seemed to warp, like it was melting into the backdrop, until I was just a shape, a shadow, surrounded by a void of nothingness. I felt my heart stop in my chest. I closed my eyes and rubbed my face, willing the images to go away. But they wouldn't. They stayed with me. My phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Do you like the photos? We're glad you could join us." And then a single word appeared on the screen. "Soon." The word "soon" lingered on my screen, taunting me as if the phone itself had become a part of some twisted game. My fingers froze on the device. The logical part of me screamed to turn off the phone and pretend it never happened, but my curiosity, or perhaps something darker, urged me to reply. I typed, my hands shaking, "Who is this?" The screen remained blank for what felt like an eternity, but then a reply came. "Ian, we haven't finished yet." A cold shiver ran down my spine. What did he mean by finished? The shoot had ended hours ago, hadn't it? I glanced at the clock. Only a few minutes had passed since I'd returned home, but it felt as if time had stretched and warped in that building. My mind spun with questions, and my hands clenched tighter around the phone. Then, another message appeared. Look again. Confused, I opened the photos once more. The first one was unchanged, still that haunting image of the woman who wasn't me. But then, I noticed something new. A small detail that hadn't been there before. In the corner of the photo, barely noticeable, was a figure. It was obscured by shadows, but I could make out the shape of a person, a tall, thin silhouette, just standing there in the fog. I could feel my pulse quicken as my gaze moved to the next photo. The figure was clearer now, standing closer, its face still hidden in the shadows. The background had started to shift too. What had been a foggy field in the first image was now an abandoned street, cracked pavement stretching endlessly under a sickly yellow sky. I could feel my breath catch in my throat. I scrolled through the rest of the photos, my hands growing clammy. With each image, the figure grew bolder, more defined. It was as if it was inching closer to me, becoming more real with every click. The last photo was the worst. It was me, standing in the middle of the street, surrounded by that same unnatural fog. But this time, the figure was standing right behind me. Its presence was suffocating, so close I could almost feel it breathing down my neck. I turned around, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. Nothing. There was no one behind me, no figure standing in the doorway of my living room. Yet, the feeling remained. The unmistakable sensation of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight. The phone buzzed again, jolting me from my thoughts. It's time, the message read. Before I could respond, another message came through. Don't be late. I stared at the screen, the room around me growing colder. I didn't want to go back to that building. I didn't want to find out what else Ian had in store for me, or what the figure in the photos wanted. But I knew, deep down, that I had no choice. The messages had a power over me, a pull that I couldn't resist. I grabbed my coat, my hands trembling as I slipped it on. I felt like I was walking through a dream. Everything seemed unreal, the walls of my apartment blurring around me, as if I was still caught in the fog from the photos. By the time I reached the street, the fog had thickened outside, curling around the buildings, creeping up the sidewalks. My breath formed clouds in the chilly air, but it was the kind of cold that reached deep into your bones. The familiar streets looked different now, distorted and alien. As I walked, my steps echoed unnaturally, the sound too loud, as if the world was holding its breath. The further I went, the more the sense of being followed grew. I glanced behind me, but saw only the empty street, bathed in fog and shadow. But something was there. I could feel it, pressing in on me, creeping through the fog. The figure from the photos? Was it real, or was it just my mind playing tricks on me? I reached the building, my heart pounding in my chest. It loomed ahead, dark and imposing, with its cracked windows and decaying walls. The door stood slightly ajar, just as it had been earlier. I stepped inside, the familiar scent of dust and stale air greeting me once more. The lobby was empty, the silence almost suffocating. I called out, "Ian?" No answer. I stepped further into the building, the sound of my footsteps reverberating through the darkened halls. As I reached the corridor where I had been before, I noticed something odd. The walls seemed different now, as if the paint had peeled away in patches, revealing something underneath. A strange symbol was drawn on the wall, scrawled in what looked like charcoal. It was a circle, with jagged lines radiating outward, like a sun, or perhaps something much darker. I hesitated, my breath caught in my throat. This wasn't the same place. It couldn't be. I turned the corner, and there, standing in the doorway of the studio, was Ian. But he was different. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide, almost too wide, as though something was controlling him. "You're late," he said, his voice low and cold. I couldn't move. Behind him, the fog from the photos began to spill into the room, swirling around his feet, creeping toward me. The shadows in the corner of the studio seemed to stretch unnaturally, pulling toward me. I could feel the figure from the photos closing in, its presence palpable in the air. And then, it spoke. "Now, it's your turn." The ground beneath me shifted, and the world around me cracked open like fragile glass, revealing an abyss I could no longer escape. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing together as if trying to suffocate me. The fog enveloped my feet, rising slowly as if it had a life of its own, curling around my ankles like a cold embrace. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, the air thick with a strange, damp pressure. I glanced back at Ian, but he was no longer standing there. His form was consumed by the darkness, his face disappearing into the shadows. The voice from the corner of the room whispered again, cold and hollow. "Now, it's your turn." I froze, my heart pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. The room was no longer just a space, it had become something alive, a breathing, living thing. The air felt thick, heavy with an oppressive weight that seemed to press down on me from all sides. I could hear faint rustling sounds in the distance, like something was moving just out of sight, something I couldn't quite make out. I stepped backward, my body moving on instinct, but every step I took seemed to draw me deeper into the darkness. The studio, which had once seemed so familiar, now felt alien, distorted by the fog that clung to every surface. The floor creaked underfoot as if the building itself was groaning, warning me to leave. But there was no way out. The door behind me, which I had just entered through, had disappeared. There was only a thick wall of mist where it should have been, the air thickening around me. Panic set in, my mind racing, my hands shaking. I wanted to run, to escape, but my body wouldn't respond. I couldn't move. My eyes darted around, searching for anything familiar, anything that might guide me out, but the space felt endless, expanding in all directions, as if the very dimensions of the room had been altered. And then, I saw it again, the figure. It was standing in the shadows, just like in the photos. The same tall, thin silhouette, its features obscured by the darkness. But this time, it was clearer, more defined. I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing against my chest. It was watching me, waiting. I could see the faint outline of its face now, or at least I thought I did. But there was something wrong about it, something unnatural. Its eyes glowed faintly, but they weren't eyes at all. They were empty spaces, voids that sucked in the light, drawing everything toward them. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the thick fog, trapped in my throat. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on something. I fell to the floor, the cold surface biting into my skin. The figure moved, shifting closer, its shape warping as if it was made of smoke, its form flickering in and out of existence. It reached out a hand, long, spindly fingers extending toward me, and I knew, deep down, that it wasn't human. The space around me seemed to collapse, the walls closing in, the floor beneath me cracking like ice. I could feel myself falling into the void where reality no longer made sense. The figure loomed closer, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. "Take your place," it whispered, and I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, pulling me toward it. I tried to resist, to push away, but it was no use. I couldn't move, couldn't fight back. My body felt heavy, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on me, dragging me deeper into the abyss. The more I struggled, the more I felt myself fading, slipping away from reality. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The fog receded, the shadows pulled back, and the room was still. I was no longer in the studio. The walls were gone, replaced by a void of endless blackness. The figure was gone, and so was Ian. There was no sound, no movement, only the oppressive silence that stretched for eternity. I was alone. But I knew I wasn't really alone. I could feel something watching me from the darkness, something waiting. The photos had been a warning, and I had ignored them. Now, there was no escape. I sat in the silence, the weight of what had happened crashing over me. What was real? What was I still trapped in? The line between reality and illusion had blurred, and I no longer knew if I had been part of the shoot or if it had been something else entirely. And then, a final message appeared on my phone. It's over. But you're not free. The screen flickered, and the words disappeared, leaving only the cold, empty screen staring back at me. And I realized, with a deep, horrifying certainty, that I would never be free. I staggered backward, the darkness in front of me twisting and shifting. My heart raced, each beat pounding in my ears as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Was this some kind of sick game? The studio, the photos, the figure, it all felt like something out of a nightmare. But it was real. I could feel the cold air on my skin, taste the bitterness of fear in the back of my throat. Ian's face remained blank, his eyes wide and unblinking. There was no recognition, no warmth in them, only a cold emptiness that made my skin crawl. He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, as though the fog had wrapped itself around him, controlling his every move. Ian, I whispered, but my voice trembled. What's happening? What is this? His lips curled into a twisted smile. You know what this is. Don't pretend you don't. I shook my head, taking another step back. The walls seemed to press in on me, closing in, suffocating. The fog spilled into the room, filling the corners, creeping up the walls. My breath caught in my throat. The air felt heavier now, like I was breathing underwater. I don't understand. My voice cracked as I struggled to speak. Why me? What do you want from me? Ian didn't answer. Instead, he stepped aside, revealing the darkened doorway behind him. I could see something now, something I hadn't noticed before. A figure, just standing there in the shadows. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its presence felt like a weight pressing down on me. My mind screamed for me to run, to escape, but my feet refused to move. The figure seemed to shift, as though it were coming closer, though I couldn't see its face. It wasn't a man or a woman. It wasn't human at all. I could feel it. Its eyes were on me, watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. The air around me was charged, like the atmosphere before a storm. My head swam with confusion, but something in the back of my mind told me this was no accident. This was all planned. It was then that I realized I had been part of this all along. The photos, the strange invitation, Ian's cryptic messages, they weren't just coincidences. They were pieces of a puzzle I had been unknowingly putting together. I turned to Ian, desperation flooding my veins. Please. What do you want from me? For a moment, there was silence, and then, In a voice that seemed to come from all around me, Ian spoke. You were chosen. We all have our roles to play. The figure moved again, its form becoming more defined in the mist. It reached out with long, spindly arms, its fingers curling like claws. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe as it stepped closer, the fog swallowing it whole, until only its silhouette remained. You've been chosen to complete the cycle, Ian's voice echoed, now distant, as though coming from a place I couldn't reach. The figure reached out again, its hand grazing my cheek. A chill, colder than any I had ever felt, shot through me. The world around me began to blur, the edges of reality fraying like old fabric. I could still hear the soft thrum of Ian's voice, but it was becoming muffled, as if I were sinking into some deep, uncharted abyss. The photos. The shoot. Everything was leading to this moment. And as the figure's hand closed around my throat, I realized that I hadn't just been a part of the photo shoot. I had become part of the story. The story that was about to consume me. The last thing I saw before the world went black was the figure, its face finally visible, horribly familiar, and yet not my own. I don't know how long I was out, but when I opened my eyes, the room had changed. The fog had vanished, leaving behind a suffocating silence. The air was thick and still, almost unnatural in its calm. My body felt heavy, as though it had been dragged across a distance I couldn't remember. I was lying on the cold floor of the studio, the harsh fluorescent lights above me flickering intermittently. My breath came in shallow gasps, my chest rising and falling erratically. Slowly, I forced myself to sit up, a wave of dizziness washing over me as I tried to regain control of my senses. The figure was gone, but I could still feel it. Its presence lingered in the air, like a shadow clinging to my skin. I rubbed my face, trying to erase the image of it from my mind, but it was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again, the tall, thin form, its fingers outstretched, its face not quite my own. The realization hit me like a slap. The photos. The shoot. Everything was connected. I hadn't just been part of some art project. I was part of a much darker plan. The invitation, the mysterious photographer, the strange visions, they weren't coincidences. They were all leading me here, to this moment. I forced myself to my feet, my legs unsteady beneath me. I needed answers. I needed to know what had happened, what had been done to me. The studio around me was eerily empty, the only sound the low hum of the fluorescent lights above. I moved toward the exit, my mind racing. I had to find Ian. I had to find out what he had done to me, what had happened to the other models, to the others who had disappeared. But as I reached for the door, something stopped me. A voice. Not Ian's. Not even human. It came from the darkness, a low whisper that seemed to echo in the very air. You cannot escape. My heart skipped a beat as I turned, but there was no one there. The room remained empty, the walls closing in around me. You cannot escape, the voice repeated, louder this time. I could feel it, like a physical weight pressing down on me. The walls were no longer just walls. They were alive, breathing, watching. I backed away from the door, my hands trembling as I grasped at the walls for support. The air was thick now, almost suffocating, and the temperature dropped with each passing second. I felt a chill creeping into my bones, freezing me from the inside out. The lights flickered again, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something move in the corner of my vision. A shadow. A face. My own face. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, the floor tilting at an impossible angle. The walls seemed to bend, the edges of the room warping as if I were trapped inside a distorted reflection. I stumbled backward, my mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. The studio was no longer just a place. It was a prison, a trap, and I was its prey. I had to get out. I had to escape before it consumed me completely. But as I turned to run, something caught my eye. A photo. A single photograph hanging on the wall, its frame cracked and askew. It was a picture of me, of my face, taken during the shoot. But it wasn't the same. The woman in the photo wasn't me, not entirely. There was something different about her. Something wrong. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. The woman in the picture had my eyes, but they were empty, hollow. Her smile was too wide, too perfect. And beneath the surface, something dark lingered, something that made my skin crawl. I reached out to touch the photo, but as soon as my fingers brushed the glass, the image shifted. It twisted, contorting into something unrecognizable. My face stretched and distorted, the eyes growing larger, the smile widening grotesquely. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The walls seemed to pulse with life now, the air thick with the stench of decay. I could feel something closing in on me, something that wasn't human, something that had no form. The photo on the wall was no longer just a picture. It was a window. A window into a twisted reality where I no longer belonged. I turned, running as fast as I could, my mind screaming for me to escape. But no matter where I went, the walls closed in. The studio was no longer a place of creativity. It was a prison, a nightmare, and I was trapped inside it. The last thing I saw before the darkness overtook me was my own face, staring back at me from the reflection of a broken mirror. It wasn't my face anymore. It was something else. Something other. I woke up in a different place, though the feeling was strangely familiar. My eyes fluttered open, the harsh fluorescent lights above me burning my vision. My body was stiff, as though I'd been lying still for hours or days, but I couldn't remember when I had last moved. I was no longer in the studio. The room around me was small, plain. A sparse bed, a few chairs, a desk, and a single window with heavy curtains blocking out the light. The air smelled stale, almost suffocating. For a brief moment, I thought maybe I had escaped the nightmare. But the sense of dread was still there, a heavy weight on my chest, suffocating me. I didn't understand what was happening. The last thing I could remember clearly was running through the distorted, warped studio, trying to get out before everything swallowed me whole. And then, darkness. But now, here I was, alone. I sat up on the bed, feeling the cold metal frame beneath me. The room was silent, too silent. There were no sounds of life, no distant traffic, no birds chirping outside, not even the hum of electronics. Just silence. I stood, my legs shaky as I moved toward the door. The handle was cold to the touch, but it turned easily. I stepped out into a hallway that looked strangely empty, the walls bare, the floor spotless. It reminded me of the studio, but this place was worse. There was no warmth, no character. It was as if the whole building existed to make you feel small, insignificant. I took a hesitant step forward, my breath catching in my throat. Was I still dreaming? Was any of this real? Then, I heard it. A sound, faint at first but growing louder. The unmistakable click of a camera shutter. My blood ran cold. It couldn't be. Not again. I turned, and there they were. Figures standing just down the hallway, familiar faces, but distorted. Twisted. It was them. The same people from the shoot. Only now, they were different. Their faces were too perfect, their bodies unnaturally still, as if frozen in time. Their eyes followed me, but not in the way people normally look at you. It was colder. Detached. Then, they raised their cameras, and the shutters clicked again. Each click felt like it echoed through my bones. I froze in place, unable to move as I felt the weight of their gaze pressing down on me. Their eyes were empty. Their smiles, too wide, too fake. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet wouldn't budge. The flashes of their cameras burst, one after the other, each one lighting up the hallway for a split second. I could feel the pictures, the images of me, being captured in the air. I could almost see them, frozen moments of myself, each one more twisted than the last. My face stretched, warped. My body bent in unnatural angles. Each flash was a distortion of the reality I once knew. Why are you doing this? I whispered, my voice trembling. They didn't answer. They didn't need to. The hallway stretched on forever, a never-ending line of doors, each one leading to more of them. More distorted figures with cameras. More faces staring at me like I was their prey. I turned, trying to find another way out, but the space was endless. No exits. No escape. The air thickened, the oppressive silence broken only by the sound of the camera clicks. The figures moved closer, and I could feel myself suffocating under their gaze. I could feel the walls closing in on me. Then, in the distance, I saw a door, just one. The door I needed. I ran. I ran as fast as I could, pushing myself forward with every ounce of strength I had left. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. The figures were behind me now, chasing me, their footsteps too quiet to hear, but I could feel them getting closer. Their cameras kept snapping, the flashes blinding, but I couldn't afford to look back. I reached the door, my hand gripping the handle as I yanked it open. And then, I stopped. The room inside was familiar. Too familiar. It was the studio. The same walls. The same cold, sterile lights. But this time, there was no photographer. No strange figure. Just me, standing in front of a mirror, looking at myself. Only, it wasn't really me. I wasn't alone. Behind me, I could see the shadow of another figure, a taller, darker version of myself. It stood there, motionless, its eyes locked onto mine. The door slammed shut behind me, and I felt a chill creep up my spine. The figure stepped forward, its presence suffocating. And then, I understood. This was the end. The cycle wasn't just going to end. It was going to repeat over and over. The photographs, the distortion, the strange invitation, it had all been leading to this. I was caught. A piece of a larger puzzle I didn't even understand. But it didn't matter anymore. The flash of a camera. The click of the shutter. Another picture. Another version of me. The cycle had begun again. It was the kind of morning that felt like any other. The hum of the fluorescent lights above, the soft chatter of colleagues in the background, the steady ticking of the office clock. Everything was ordinary, as it always was. But sometimes, when things feel too normal, you start to notice the small things, the things that don't quite fit. I walked into the office, my tired eyes scanning the space. The desk was where I'd left it, the chair still slightly askew, a few coffee cups scattered around. My day had barely started, but something was off. I couldn't place it at first, a strange sensation hanging in the air. I shrugged it off, thinking it was nothing more than the stress of the week catching up with me. But then I saw it. On the chair next to my desk, sitting there as if it belonged, was an old, worn-out hat. It was dark brown, a little frayed at the edges, with a band that had seen better days. At first glance, I thought it was a prop, a joke someone had left for me to find. But there was a note attached to it, folded neatly in half. The handwriting on the paper was hurried, slanted, but the words were clear. I remember you. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't recognize the handwriting. I didn't recognize the hat. I stood there for a moment, staring at it. My mind was racing. Who would leave something like this? A hat, a message, and nothing else. No explanation. No signature. Just those words, I remember you. I glanced around the office. My coworkers were scattered about, oblivious to the strange object on my chair. None of them had noticed it. No one had left it there. The oddity of the situation only deepened as I looked around. It wasn't just the hat, it was the unsettling silence that had settled over the office, like something was waiting, watching. I picked up the note, my fingers trembling slightly as I unfolded it. There was nothing more written. Just those 4 words, and a strange sense of familiarity that gnawed at the back of my mind. Maybe it's just some kind of joke, I muttered to myself, trying to convince myself that there was nothing to worry about. But deep down, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. It was as if something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to realize it. I shook my head, trying to dispel the feeling. It wasn't possible. This was an office, not some haunted house. I dropped the note on my desk, and reluctantly, I placed the hat aside. Still, it lingered in my mind. As the day went on, I tried to focus on my work. But the hat, it wouldn't leave me. Every time I glanced at it, I felt like I was being watched. I began to wonder if I was imagining things. But then, just before lunch, one of my colleagues, Anna, walked past my desk and paused. "Who left that there?" she asked, her eyes widening slightly as she looked at the hat. "I don't know," I replied, my voice tight. "I just found it this morning." She squinted at the hat and then at me. "That's weird. No one has been in here today except you, right?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure anymore. Anna frowned, clearly uncomfortable. "It's kind of creepy, don't you think? Maybe it's a prank?" "I guess," I said, but even as I spoke, I wasn't sure if that's all it was. Something about the hat felt wrong, as if it had been placed there for a reason, something I wasn't meant to understand. She walked away, but the nagging feeling remained. The feeling that the hat was more than just a joke. I tried to return to my work, but the hum of the lights above seemed louder now, the ticking of the clock more pronounced. Every now and then, I could hear the soft shuffle of footsteps in the hallway, though no one ever passed by. And I began to wonder, had they always been there? Or was it just my imagination? The day dragged on, but I couldn't shake the sense of unease. Every time I looked at the hat, I felt like it was waiting for me to do something. Or waiting for something. But what? I had no answers, only questions. And the longer I looked at it, the more I felt like I was staring at something familiar, something I had forgotten. The next day came with no answers, only a growing sense of discomfort. I had hoped it would be gone, that maybe someone would come forward and explain the hat, the note, the feeling that had been gnawing at me. But as I walked into the office, there it was again, sitting on my chair, as if nothing had changed. The hat. It seemed almost worse now, somehow. Its faded brown color seemed duller, the frayed edges more pronounced, as if it had been waiting for me all night, just to make me uneasy. I felt the same knot tighten in my stomach as I approached it. I stood there, staring at the note on the desk beside it. The same words, written in the same hurried, almost frantic handwriting. I remember you. I didn't know why, but those words felt like they were digging into me. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like a part of my past was somehow slipping back into the present, just out of reach. I wasn't sure I wanted to find out what it meant, but a part of me, some small, curious part, knew I couldn't just leave it. I picked up the note, my hands cold despite the warm office air. The message had barely registered before I heard the soft click of footsteps behind me. I spun around quickly, my heart pounding. No one was there. I glanced around the office. Everyone was absorbed in their work, just like yesterday. Yet, that unmistakable feeling of being watched hung in the air, thicker now. I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts, but they lingered. Had someone been behind me just then? Or was it just the building settling? I glanced back at the hat, my gaze unwillingly drawn to it again. It wasn't just the hat. It was the space around it, the stillness, the quiet. Everything in the room felt too still, too precise. My mind raced, trying to find some logical explanation. But every explanation felt hollow, incomplete. "You're overthinking this," I whispered to myself, but the words felt weak even to me. I took the hat, hoping to just get rid of it, to move it somewhere else. I placed it in a small storage closet at the end of the hall, behind a stack of old files. As I turned to leave, I thought I heard a faint rustling sound, like fabric brushing against fabric. I froze. It couldn't be. I had just put the hat there. I hadn't heard anyone else enter the room. I walked back slowly, carefully, to the closet. As I reached for the door handle, I couldn't help but feel a chill spread down my spine. When I opened it, the hat was gone. Gone. My heart skipped a beat. I stumbled back, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. It couldn't be. There was no way it could have moved on its own. But the closet was empty, and the hat was no longer there. I rushed back to my desk, my breath quickening. Panic was starting to seep in, but I couldn't let it take control. I had to think logically. I must have put the hat somewhere else without realizing it. I must have. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The hat couldn't have just disappeared. I knew that, but I didn't know how to prove it. How to explain it. I sat back down at my desk, trying to focus on my work, but the sound of my own heartbeat seemed to drown out everything else. Every slight noise in the office, the clicking of a keyboard, the murmur of voices, sounded louder now, somehow sharper. The walls felt like they were closing in. And then, I heard it. A faint, distant whisper, barely audible over the noise of the office. It wasn't clear, but the words felt familiar. I couldn't make them out, but something about it sounded like my name. I looked around. No one seemed to notice. No one seemed to hear it but me. I stood up, my heart pounding now, and walked toward the break room, trying to shake off the feeling that was settling over me like a heavy fog. I needed a break, just a few minutes to clear my head. But when I stepped inside, I stopped dead in my tracks. The hat was there, sitting on the counter, waiting for me. I froze, staring at it, my chest tightening. How had it gotten there? I didn't want to touch it. I didn't want to come any closer. But I had to know. I reached out slowly, my fingers brushing the edge of the hat. It felt cold, unnaturally cold, as if it had been outside in the snow for hours. I recoiled, but before I could pull my hand away, I heard it again, the whisper. This time, it was clearer. I remember you. I stumbled back, my breath shallow, my mind spinning. The voice wasn't just in my head anymore. It was real. And it was coming from the hat. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, but nothing made sense. The whisper had come from the hat, and it was too real to dismiss as a trick of my imagination. I backed away from the counter, my legs unsteady, and in that moment, the office felt smaller, too small for the things that were beginning to creep in. I was no longer alone. I glanced around the break room, as if someone could explain it all, as if someone could offer a logical explanation. But there was only the low hum of the fridge, the faint murmur of voices from the hallway. No one seemed to notice anything unusual. No one but me. I looked down at the hat again, my eyes fixed on it, my breath shallow. It hadn't moved, not physically. But there was something in the air now, something thick, suffocating. The space between me and the hat seemed to shimmer with a strange energy, like the air itself was vibrating. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't. I'm losing it, I whispered to myself, trying to steady my breath. The office, once so familiar, now felt like a different place altogether, one I didn't recognize. The walls felt closer, the lights brighter, almost oppressive. The floor beneath my feet seemed to shift, as if the ground was no longer solid, no longer stable. I turned and left the break room in a daze, my feet carrying me back to my desk without thinking. I needed to sit down. I needed to pull myself together. But the moment I sat, the whispering started again. This time, I could hear it more clearly, like it was coming from just behind me. I remember you. I froze. The voice was unmistakable. It wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. It was as if someone had spoken directly into my ear, yet when I turned around, there was no one there. My hands gripped the edge of my desk as I tried to steady myself. My head was spinning, my thoughts scattered like a puzzle I couldn't put together. I looked at the clock. It was almost time to leave. But all I could think about was the hat, the message. It all felt wrong. The room suddenly felt like it was closing in on me. The sounds around me, once so familiar, now grated on my nerves. The clacking of keyboards, the soft murmur of voices, the faint ringing of the phones. It was all too much, all too loud. And then, without warning, I heard it. A knock. It wasn't from the door. It was from the wall, a soft tap that echoed through the room, like someone was knocking just out of sight. I stood up quickly, my breath coming in shallow bursts. My heart raced in my chest. I couldn't explain it. The noise, it wasn't right. It wasn't like the usual creaks and shifts of the building. This was deliberate. Someone was trying to get my attention. I turned toward the wall, my body stiff, my mind refusing to accept what was happening. Another knock. And then I heard a voice. But this time it wasn't a whisper. It was clear, loud, and unmistakable. I remember you. My blood ran cold. I turned toward the source of the voice. The sound wasn't coming from the wall anymore, not from behind me, but from the hat, sitting there, right on my desk, as if it had always been there. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. But it was. I knew it was. The office around me had shifted. The walls felt like they were pressing in. The light above flickered, casting erratic shadows across the room. The sound of footsteps in the hall, the faint murmur of conversations, it all started to blur together like a distorted, muffled sound that didn't belong in the space anymore. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of there. I couldn't breathe. But as I reached for my bag, I felt a hand on my shoulder. A cold, clammy hand. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat, my heart racing as I stumbled backward. No one was there. No one had touched me. But the sensation, the pressure of a hand lingering on my skin, was real. So real. I looked down at the desk. The hat was still there, but now it seemed different. The edges were sharper, the shadows beneath it deeper, as if something was hiding just beneath it, waiting to emerge. I couldn't stay in that room any longer. I didn't know what was happening, but I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed my things, my hands shaking violently as I rushed for the door. But just as I reached the hallway, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't a whisper. The words echoed in my ears, clear and unmistakable. I remember you. I stopped in my tracks. The voice was louder, more insistent this time. The walls seemed to close in tighter, the air colder. I felt like I was being pulled in every direction, like the very fabric of reality was bending around me. And then I saw it. A figure standing in the doorway of the office. A figure I couldn't make out, its face hidden in shadows. But the shape, it was unmistakable. It was there, watching me. The air felt thick, suffocating. I didn't wait for it to come closer. I turned and ran, the sound of my footsteps echoing down the empty hallway. And just as I reached the stairs, the whisper came again, a voice from the depths of the darkness. I remember you. And then, there was nothing. I didn't know how long I ran. It felt like an eternity, like the world was spinning and I couldn't escape the pull of it. The office, the hat, the voice, I couldn't make sense of any of it. But as I burst through the exit doors and into the street, the air outside felt different. It felt real. The cool wind on my skin, the distant sounds of cars, the murmur of voices around me, it was normal. It was safe. At least, that's what I tried to tell myself. I walked quickly, trying to calm my racing heart. But with every step, I felt the weight of the situation settle deeper into my chest. The office was behind me now, but I could still hear the voice in my mind echoing, repeating those same words. I remember you. I shuddered, pushing the thought away as I tried to focus on the street ahead. The world seemed to go on, unaware of the nightmare I was trapped in. People walked by, heads down, lost in their own thoughts. No one noticed me. No one seemed to notice anything strange at all. I reached my apartment building, my hands trembling as I fumbled for my keys. When I finally got inside, I locked the door behind me, feeling a strange sense of security in the familiar surroundings. I sank onto the couch, my mind racing, my body exhausted. But there was no peace. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, waiting for me. The whisper in my mind, the shadow I'd seen in the hallway, it was all too real. It wasn't over. I looked around the apartment, trying to reassure myself that everything was normal. But it wasn't. The silence felt oppressive now. The air in the room, once comforting, now felt thick, heavy, like it was holding something back. I stood up and paced the room, trying to distract myself, but my thoughts kept returning to the office, to the hat, to the voice. I needed answers, but I didn't know where to begin. The phone on the table buzzed, startling me out of my thoughts. I quickly grabbed it, hoping for some distraction, something to bring me back to reality. It was a message from Anna. "Hey, I know this might sound crazy, but did anything weird happen today? I feel like something's off. I don't know what it is, but I've been hearing things. Thought I heard someone whisper my name in the hall. And I could swear I saw someone standing at the end of the corridor, but when I looked again, no one was there." My heart skipped a beat. I read the message again, slowly, my mind racing. Anna was hearing things too. I wasn't the only one. I quickly typed back, "Anna, what do you mean? What did you see? Did something happen?" The response came quickly, "I don't know." It was like someone was watching us, but I don't know. It didn't feel real. Like a dream, but I know it wasn't. What about you? Have you noticed anything strange? I'm starting to freak out. My fingers shook as I typed my reply. I found a hat in my office. It had a note that said, "I remember you. And I think it's following me. I'm not sure, but something's not right." I stared at the message, my mind spinning. I wasn't alone. Anna had felt it too. Before I could even think of a response, another message came through. "Wait. I think I see it again." I froze. My blood ran cold as I reread the message. "What do you mean, Anna?" I typed quickly, but there was no response. Not for a long time. I stood up, pacing the apartment again, my mind clouded with fear. I couldn't explain it, but everything inside me screamed that I needed to get back to the office. I needed to find out what was happening. I grabbed my coat, my hands trembling, and made my way out the door. But as I stepped into the hallway, I heard it. A whisper. It wasn't a voice in my head anymore. It was a sound in the air, a low murmur that made my skin crawl. It came from the stairwell, as if something was waiting for me there. I stopped, my breath caught in my throat. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My heart hammered in my chest. I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to face whatever it was that was following me. But I knew I had to. I had to know what was happening. I had to end it, whatever it was. I walked slowly toward the stairwell, my steps hesitant. The whisper grew louder, clearer. "I remember you." I froze. There, at the top of the stairs, was the figure. It was standing in the shadowed corner, barely visible, but its presence was undeniable. The same shape I had seen in the office. The same shape that had been following me all this time. The figure stepped forward, and I saw it clearly for the first time. It was wearing the hat. The same hat. The one I had found in the office. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My mind went blank. And then the figure spoke. "Do you remember me?" I shook my head, unable to speak. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. My thoughts were tangled, my mind screaming for me to do something, anything, to get away. But all I could do was stare. "I remember you," the figure repeated, its voice low and eerie. The hat shifted, and suddenly, I saw its face. It was me. It was my face. But twisted, distorted, like a reflection in a broken mirror. A version of me that shouldn't exist. A version of me that had been waiting, watching. The world around me seemed to warp and distort, and I realized with a sickening certainty that there was no escape. "I remember you," it whispered again. And then everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. Time seemed to stretch and warp, like I had been lost in a dream or maybe a nightmare. My head throbbed as I slowly came to, my vision blurred, my body heavy, as if I had been dragged across the ground. I opened my eyes, blinking against the harsh light that flooded the room. My surroundings were unfamiliar, cold. The walls were bare, the floor a dull gray concrete. I was no longer in the hallway or the apartment. Where was I? Panic surged in my chest, but I forced myself to take a deep breath to steady myself. I looked around. The room was small, claustrophobic, with a single, low-hanging bulb above me that cast long shadows on the walls. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in ages. I tried to sit up, but my body felt stiff, as though it had been immobilized for far longer than I realized. My legs wobbled when I stood, and I had to hold onto the wall to keep my balance. I glanced down at myself, my clothes rumpled and torn. The memory of the figure, of the version of me, the distorted face, flashed in my mind. The figure had been real. It had been real, and it had said it remembered me. I couldn't escape that voice. That whisper. "I remember you." The walls seemed to close in again, the air thick with the sense of being watched. I looked around, but there was no one there, no sign of life, just the eerie emptiness. I started to move toward the only door in the room, my steps hesitant. My mind was a jumbled mess of thoughts and fear, but I had to get out of here. I had to find Anna, find answers, and stop whatever was happening before it consumed me entirely. As I approached the door, I heard the faintest sound, footsteps. Not behind me, but ahead, just beyond the door. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, my heart hammering in my chest. I reached for the handle, my fingers trembling, and opened the door slowly. What I saw on the other side made my blood run cold. The hallway stretched before me, but it wasn't the same hallway I remembered. It was darker, distorted, like a reflection in a cracked mirror. The walls were covered in shadows that seemed to move, as if alive. The air felt thick and oppressive, as if something was pressing down from all sides. I stepped into the hallway, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the silence. I could hear breathing now, faint but unmistakable. I wasn't alone. The sound came from the end of the hall, a figure standing in the shadows. It was tall, its features obscured by the darkness. But I could feel it, watching me, waiting for me. I froze in place, my breath catching in my throat. The figure stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. The shadows seemed to part around it as it moved, revealing more of its form. It was wearing a hat. The same hat. The one I had found in the office. And then, I saw its face. It was me. But not exactly. It was my face, but the eyes were wrong, dull, lifeless, like they had seen too much. The skin was pale, almost sickly, and the expression was one of cold detachment, as if nothing mattered anymore. The figure stepped closer, and I could feel its presence, like it was inside me, invading my mind. "I remember you," it said, its voice cold and hollow. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My mind screamed at me to get away, but my body betrayed me. "I remember you," it repeated, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "You can't escape." The words echoed in the hallway, filling every corner, every crack in the walls. I felt like I was drowning in them. And then, the figure reached out, its hand brushing against my cheek. Cold. I shuddered, but I couldn't pull away. I was frozen in place, unable to escape the horror of the moment. The figure's lips curled into a twisted smile. "You're mine now," it whispered, and the world around me started to blur. The hallway twisted, the walls collapsing in on themselves, the floor warping like liquid. I felt my body being pulled into the shadows, dragged deeper into the void. "No! No!" I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. I could feel myself slipping away, like I was fading, vanishing into nothingness. The last thing I heard was the whisper, louder than ever, filling every inch of space. "I remember you." And then, there was nothing. I woke up again. This time, I wasn't in the hallway. I wasn't anywhere. It was just darkness. Complete and total silence. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was trapped. Trapped in the darkness, alone with the voice. Alone with the memory. The memory of the hat. The memory of the figure. The memory of myself. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.